Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It all started with a question. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you found a book that described your life, everything that had ever happened to you, right up to this very moment? Not just your past, but your present, your thoughts, your surroundings. Every breath, every glance, every step. What if that book was lying on a shelf, waiting for you to discover it? I didn't know it then, but that question would become the least of my concerns. It was a quiet afternoon when I walked into the library. The familiar scent of dust and old paper filled the air. The wooden shelves creaked under the weight of so many forgotten stories, and the low murmur of the fluorescent lights was the only sound besides my footsteps. I had been there many times before, but today something felt different. There was a strange stillness, as if the place itself was holding its breath. I wandered through the aisles, aimlessly at first, then with a sense of purpose that I couldn't quite place. I was searching for nothing in particular, just browsing, lost in my thoughts. But then, I saw it. A book, sitting on the edge of a shelf. It was out of place, as if someone had carelessly put it there. Its pages were yellowed, and it had no cover. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I reached for the book, and the moment my fingers brushed against the rough, bare paper, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I pulled it off the shelf, the book feeling strangely heavy in my hands. I opened it. The first page was blank. I flipped through the next few pages, expecting nothing more than empty space. But as I turned to the third page, my heart skipped a beat. There, written in neat, tight handwriting, was a description of my day. Not just any day, but today. It described my walk into the library, my thoughts about the weather, my desire to find something new. It was as if someone had been following me, recording everything I did. At first, I laughed. It was a coincidence, I thought. A weird prank. But as I kept reading, the details became more specific. It wasn't just about my actions, it was about my emotions, my very thoughts. It described my unease, the sense that something was wrong. It described the way the library smelled, how the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, how the shadows seemed to move just a little too fast. It was as if the book could see inside my mind. The words on the page grew more unsettling. The description of my surroundings became eerily accurate, almost as if the book knew things I hadn't even noticed. The words seemed to change, shifting as I read. They started to describe my movements, my very next step. The book was following me. I looked up from the pages, my heart racing. The library around me seemed to have grown colder. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the walls were closing in. I glanced at the shelves, the aisles, the people scattered in their own worlds. But it was different now. The shadows were longer, the silence deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned the page. It was then that I saw it. The words were no longer just describing my actions, they were predicting them. It was as if the book could see the future. It described my next move before I made it. How I would step towards the aisle to my left, how I would pull another book off the shelf, and how I would sit down at a nearby table. It described the exact moment I would start to feel an overwhelming sense of dread, the sudden coldness creeping into my bones. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. This book, this thing, knew me. It knew my thoughts, my actions, and it was making them happen. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the library. I looked up, startled. The sound seemed to come from nowhere, but the moment I turned my gaze back to the page, it changed. The book had begun to write something new, something that hadn't happened yet, but was about to. It described the exact place where I would be when the noise occurred. The exact place I had just been standing. I could feel my pulse quicken. The air around me grew still, too still. My mind raced, my thoughts a blur, but one thing was clear: I was no longer alone in this library. Someone, or something, was watching me. And it wasn't just the book. I slammed the book shut, my fingers trembling. I wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to escape the feeling that it was following me, predicting me, controlling me. But the strange pull that had drawn me to it was still there, like an invisible thread tethering me to the very thing I feared. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The silence in the library felt suffocating now. The distant hum of the lights seemed to be growing louder, as if they too were aware of the danger that surrounded me. I turned and walked away, but the book remained in my hands. It was like a weight I couldn't shake off. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there. But the aisles were empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching from the shadows. I didn't want to know what would happen next. But deep down, I already did. The book weighed heavily in my hands as I walked through the aisles of the library. My mind was racing. What had just happened? Could I trust what I had read? Or was it just some twisted coincidence, a strange prank, or a series of coincidences stacked on top of one another? My heart was still pounding in my chest, and a sickening chill crawled up my spine. The deeper I went into the library, the more the familiar surroundings seemed to twist and warp, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I could still feel the book's presence, as though it was alive. It felt like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to turn the next page. But I couldn't. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. The longer I stayed, the more real it felt, the more it seemed to have control over everything around me. I found a seat near the back of the library, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of the madness I had just experienced. I wanted to forget about the book, forget about everything, but the image of those words, so precise, so detailed, kept replaying in my mind. The book knew things. Too many things. It described not just my actions, but my thoughts, my emotions. It was like someone was inside my mind, seeing everything I saw. The hum of the fluorescent lights was louder now, grating against my nerves. The library, once a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, where the air itself seemed to thicken with every passing second. I tried to focus on something, anything, to drown out the unease. But then the book called to me, beckoning me back. I opened it again. I couldn't stop myself. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, each one more unsettling than the last. The words seemed to swirl in front of my eyes, shifting and changing in a way that felt unnatural. The handwriting was still neat, still controlled, but the meaning of the words was slipping into something darker. I read on. The book described the people around me. It even described the way they were positioned in the library, their actions, their expressions. How the elderly man at the far table was reading a book on ancient history, how the woman with dark hair and a red scarf was browsing through the fiction section. It described them down to the smallest detail. Then, on the next page, it wrote something I wasn't expecting. Something that made my blood run cold. It predicted the exact moment I would hear the sound again, the thud. The same loud, unnatural noise that had echoed through the library moments before. It said I would hear it from the far side of the room at exactly 2 minutes and 32 seconds past 4 o'clock. I glanced at my watch. The time was 4:30. My heart raced. I had no idea if this was a game, if it was just a trick of my mind, but the thought of it happening again terrified me. I looked around, trying to spot anything that seemed out of place. The library, the people, everything appeared normal. Yet, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Suddenly, the sound echoed through the room. A loud thud, sharp and sudden. My body went stiff, my head snapping towards the source. It came from the far corner of the library, just like the book had predicted. But there was nothing there. No one. No object had fallen. No shelves had collapsed. It was as if the noise had come from nowhere, from the air itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a cold shiver, and my breath caught in my throat. I looked at the book in my hands. The words hadn't changed. It still held the description of what would happen next. My pulse quickened, and my vision began to blur at the edges. This couldn't be real. This wasn't real. But the fear crawling up my spine, the weight of the book in my hands, the way the library seemed to change with each passing second, it all felt too real. The book described the next part in detail, word by word. It said I would feel the need to leave. It said I would stand up, walk towards the exit, and feel a deep sense of unease creeping along with me. It said the lights would flicker just as I reached the door. The book even described my exact movements, the exact way I would breathe, the way my hands would tremble as I reached for the door handle. And then, it described something else. The last part of the page read, "When you open the door, you will not be alone." I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't want to read any further, but I couldn't stop myself. The words were pulling me in, dragging me deeper into this twisted reality that the book had woven. I turned the page, my fingers trembling violently. The next page was blank, nothing but a void. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I turned quickly, my heart slamming in my chest. But there was nothing there. Just empty aisles and rows of books, all silent. Still, the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I had to get out. I had to leave. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. The book was somehow controlling everything. The sounds, the shadows, the way the library felt like a maze. It was all part of it. I stood up abruptly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The book was heavy in my hands, its presence now undeniable. The lights flickered, just as the book had predicted. I looked towards the door, the way out. But the hallway outside the library wasn't the one I knew. I could feel it now, the shift. The atmosphere was wrong. The hallway stretched before me, too long, too narrow. The lights seemed dimmer, and the walls pressed in from all sides. A cold breeze swept through, carrying with it a faint whisper, too faint to understand, but it was there. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. As I reached for the door handle, I felt something cold and wet brush against my hand. I jerked back, my heart nearly stopping. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the door, cold and unyielding. I turned the handle, and then, as I stepped outside, the world changed. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped into the hallway. It was darker than I remembered. The fluorescent lights that usually bathed the corridor in a harsh, sterile glow were dim now, flickering weakly. The walls seemed to stretch farther than they should, their surfaces cracked and peeling like they were decaying before my eyes. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, echoing in the silence. I glanced back at the door, but the library behind me felt distant now. The familiar rows of bookshelves had disappeared, replaced by the cold emptiness of the corridor. It was like the door had sealed me off from the world I knew. I turned forward, but the hallway stretched out endlessly, a maze of unfamiliar twists and turns. There were no windows, no doors, just a long, narrow corridor that seemed to swallow up every sound. And the further I walked, the more I felt the weight of the silence press against me, like it was holding me in place, making it hard to move. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing louder than they should. The walls seemed to pulse with a low hum, almost imperceptible, but it was there, vibrating in the air. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being followed, of being watched, was unbearable. The cold air brushed against my skin, and it felt wrong, unnatural, like the very space around me had turned hostile. The corridor seemed endless. I tried to turn around, but the hallway behind me had shifted. The door to the library was nowhere to be seen. The walls had closed in, leaving me with nothing but the oppressive darkness ahead. I turned back, trying to push through the panic building in my chest. I had to get out. I had to find the exit. But no matter how many steps I took, the hallway remained the same, cold, unchanging, like a tunnel with no end. Then, a sound broke the silence. A soft shuffling, followed by a faint whisper, like someone was just behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady myself. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if someone was standing right behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I spun around, but again, there was nothing there. No one. My pulse quickened. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I forced myself to keep moving, even though every instinct told me to run. But where would I go? The hallway twisted and turned, each corner leading to more uncertainty. The book still sat in my hands, heavy and cold, as though it were drawing me forward, guiding my steps. I reached the end of the hallway, or at least I thought I did. There was a door ahead, a metal one, stark and unfamiliar. I approached it hesitantly, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. The book seemed to hum in my hands, vibrating slightly. It was as if it knew what would happen next. I turned the handle. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. I stepped inside, and my stomach dropped. I had expected another room, another corridor, but what I saw made my blood run cold. I was standing in the exact same library I had left, but everything was wrong. The shelves were in disarray, the books scattered across the floor as if something had violently thrown them aside. The air was thick, heavy with a musty, rotting scent that I had never smelled before. The lights flickered above, casting eerie shadows on the walls, twisting and stretching like they were alive. And then I saw it. A figure. It stood at the far end of the library, its back to me. It was tall, draped in dark, flowing fabric that seemed to ripple in the dim light. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the outline of its form was unmistakable. The figure turned slowly, and I felt a chill that made my bones ache. Its eyes, or what I could only assume were its eyes, glowed faintly, like two pinpricks of light in the darkness. It was staring directly at me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back through the door, but my legs wouldn't move. The book in my hands pulsed, as if it was calling me toward the figure. I could feel its presence pressing against me, pushing me closer to the thing in front of me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. The air seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping even further, until I could see my breath in front of me in a misty cloud. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, and the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the book's pull was too strong. It was as if I had no choice but to obey, to move toward the figure that stood in the shadows. I took a step forward. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it were observing me, studying my every move. I couldn't look away. Its eyes seemed to burn into mine, piercing through me like they could see every part of me, every thought, every fear. And as I took another step, the figure raised a hand, long, thin fingers that stretched unnaturally, reaching out toward me. I stopped. It wasn't the figure that terrified me. It was the book. The pages had started to change again, slowly, as if they were alive. The words were shifting, rearranging themselves, and the sentences began to make sense in a way that chilled me to the core. They weren't just predicting my actions anymore. They were describing what was happening around me, describing the figure, the dark presence that was closing in on me. And then, the words on the page stopped. I looked down, trembling. The page was blank again. But not completely. At the bottom, in dark ink, there was one sentence. You are not meant to leave. I dropped the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably. It hit the floor with a thud, but I didn't hear it. I didn't hear anything anymore. The only sound was the low hum in the air, like a growl coming from deep within the walls. And then, everything went silent. The figure was closer now, only a few feet away. It reached out with its long, cold hand, and I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't obey, my body frozen in place. The book had come alive, and I had no idea how to stop it. The cold hand reached out, its long fingers brushing against the air between us. I could feel it now, the weight of it, the force it carried. The darkness around me thickened, the walls pressing closer, like they were closing in with every breath I took. The figure's glowing eyes never left me. It didn't speak, but somehow I could hear its voice in my mind echoing in the silence. You shouldn't have opened the book. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching across the room, swallowing the light. My breath was quick, shallow, and every instinct told me to run, to escape. But the pull of the book, the weight of its power, kept me in place. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, as if my entire body was screaming to escape, to flee. But I couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. I could feel the coldness in the air, the oppressive chill that wrapped itself around me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my throat was dry, my voice lost in the fear that consumed me. You cannot escape, the voice whispered again. This time, it was clearer, more forceful, as if it was a part of the room, a part of the walls that held me captive. You are part of the story now. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to block out the presence, to escape the growing darkness. But when I opened them again, the figure was still there, standing just inches away. Its hand was outstretched, its fingers twitching, and I could feel the pull of it, the pull that was drawing me in, slowly but surely. The book. I had to think of the book. I reached down, my trembling hands moving slowly toward the ground. The pages lay open, the words shifting again, rearranging themselves before my eyes. I tried to make sense of them, to find a way out, but it was like trying to read in a storm. Everything was a blur, a swirl of letters that didn't make sense. And then, I saw it. One sentence at the very bottom of the page, written in a jagged, almost frantic hand. You must close the book. It was clear. Simple. But I wasn't sure if I could do it. If I even wanted to do it. The figure was still standing there, watching, waiting, its presence almost suffocating. Close the book, the voice repeated, this time more insistent. Or it will be too late. I glanced back at the figure, and for a moment, it seemed to shift. Its form was no longer just dark and shadowy, it began to melt, like ink spreading across a page, its body twisting and distorting. The air around me vibrated with an unnatural energy, and the book in my hands began to glow faintly, pulsing with power. The words on the pages grew more intense, more real. The line between the story and reality was blurring. The figure raised its hand again, the fingers elongating, reaching toward me. I could feel the air grow colder, the darkness closing in. It was now or never. I slammed the book shut. A deafening silence followed. The world seemed to stop, the air thick and still. For a moment, I thought nothing had changed. I was still trapped, still in the library, still facing the figure. But then, I felt it, the absence of weight, the absence of pressure. The book's influence, its power, was gone. I opened my eyes. The figure was gone. The library around me had returned to normal. The shelves were intact, the books neatly arranged, the lights buzzing overhead. Everything was as it should be. The air wasn't cold anymore, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing against me had lifted. But it wasn't over. I looked down at the book, still held tightly in my hands. The pages were closed, but I could feel it, the pull, the tug at the back of my mind, as if the book were calling me again, beckoning me to open it. I could almost hear the words in my mind, urging me to look inside. But I knew better now. I knew that the book was not just a book. It was a doorway. A doorway into something darker, something more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I couldn't let it consume me again. I had to leave it behind. I dropped the book, my hand shaking. It fell to the floor with a dull thud, and I stepped away from it. For a moment, I considered leaving, running as far away as I could. But something stopped me. A voice, faint but clear, echoed in my mind. You are part of the story now. I turned toward the door, the only way out. I could feel the weight of the words pressing against me, but I couldn't let them control me anymore. I had to leave. I stepped through the door. The library was still there, but I was no longer trapped. I was free. At least, I thought I was. I walked out into the hallway, the soft click of the door closing behind me. The corridor, once oppressive and suffocating, now felt strangely empty, almost hollow. The light above flickered and buzzed, but the air wasn't heavy anymore. The silence, which had once been terrifying, was now just the absence of sound, peaceful, almost. I thought I was safe. But even as I stepped away from the library, the unease settled deep in my chest, like a lingering shadow. The feeling that I hadn't escaped, that something was still following me, gnawed at me. I paused in the middle of the hall, feeling the cold metal handle of the door under my hand as if it were calling me back. You are part of the story now. The voice repeated in my mind like a broken record. I tried to ignore it, but the words wouldn't leave me. The grip of the book, its influence, had taken hold of me in a way I couldn't fully explain. I had closed it, yes, but in doing so, had I truly escaped? Or had I simply postponed the inevitable? I reached the stairwell at the end of the hall and hesitated before descending. The building seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. The floors creaked under my feet, but it was the only sound in the space. My heart beat in sync with the rhythm of my steps. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get out of this place, to run away and forget it all. But I couldn't. At the bottom of the stairs, I turned toward the exit. The doors loomed ahead, illuminated by the dim light of the hallway. The world outside seemed so far away, so out of reach. But as I walked closer, a strange sensation crept over me, a feeling that I wasn't alone. I stopped. I felt it, just on the edge of my awareness. The air shifted, as though something had entered the room behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Something told me not to. I reached the door, and my fingers hovered above the handle. A quiet shuffling echoed from the shadows behind me. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The book. It was lying on the ground, just a few feet away, as if it had been placed there for me to find. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't resist. The pages lay open, the edges of the paper curling slightly as if they had been touched recently. The ink swirled across the pages, shifting and changing as if the book itself were alive. It was waiting for me. The words on the page danced before my eyes, still forming and reshaping as I read them. You cannot escape the story. It is not over. You are the next chapter. I froze. The walls around me seemed to close in, the space tightening like a noose. The air became thick again, heavy with the same oppressive force I had felt in the library. The whispers returned, distant at first, then growing louder. I didn't want to open it again. I couldn't. But I was drawn to it, pulled in by the force I didn't understand. Every instinct told me to leave it, to walk away, but the book's call was undeniable. I reached down, my fingers trembling. I couldn't stop myself. The moment I touched the pages, I felt it, a sharp, electric jolt that ran up my arm, straight to my chest. The world around me seemed to collapse, and I was pulled into the book's grasp, swallowed by the words. I didn't even have time to react. The door to the outside world disappeared. The hallway faded into darkness. All that remained was the book and the voice, repeating its words in my mind. You are part of the story now. The words began to shift again, rearranging, telling a new tale. My story. My fate. I had opened the door, but I didn't walk through it. I stepped into the story. Have you ever noticed something that didn't seem right, but couldn't quite place what it was? Maybe it was a flicker in the corner of your eye, or a sound that only appeared when you weren't listening for it. I know I have. It started with the light in the window. It was late, just past midnight. I had been sitting by the window in my living room, trying to ignore the ache in my chest, the feeling of being trapped in my own thoughts. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe a distraction, maybe a sign that things weren't as bad as they seemed. It was then that I saw it. The light. In the house across the street, in a room that always seemed dark, always empty. Every night, at exactly the same time, the light would flicker on in that window. Just one room. The rest of the house remained untouched. I had lived across from that house for years, and I knew it as well as my own. The house was abandoned, or so I thought. No one had lived there for as long as I could remember. But every night, that same light would shine, like it was waiting for something or someone. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a light on a timer, or some neighbor running an errand. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the light itself, but the way it would flicker, almost as if it were trying to get my attention. It became a routine. I couldn't stop myself from looking for it every night, waiting for that soft glow to appear in the window across the street. And sure enough, there it was. But something was different tonight. The light seemed brighter, more intense. It almost felt like it was calling to me. I knew I should ignore it, but I couldn't. My curiosity gnawed at me. What if there was someone there, someone who needed help? What if something had happened to the house, to the people who might have lived there? So, I decided, tonight, I would go over. Tonight, I would find out what was behind that light. The air was cold as I left my apartment. The streets were quiet, save for the sound of my footsteps on the cracked pavement. My heart raced with each step I took. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the closer I got to the house, the more the unease settled in. The house was old, its once elegant structure now decaying, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling from the wooden frame. Yet, that light was still shining from one of the upstairs windows. I reached the front gate, the metal creaking as I pushed it open. My breath came in shallow bursts, the chill of the night air mixing with the warmth of my anxiety. The house stood silent, watching me, as if it knew I was there. I could almost feel the weight of the light on me, pulling me toward the door. I stepped onto the porch, the old wood groaning under my feet. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned me forward. I hesitated. Something about it didn't sit right. But I had come this far. I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and forgotten years. It felt like no one had lived here for decades, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I walked slowly through the dark hallway, my footsteps echoing against the walls. The light from the window above me cast strange shadows along the floor, making the house feel even larger, more ominous. At the end of the hall, I saw it. The room with the light. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see the glow coming from within. It was the strangest light I had ever seen, warm and inviting yet unsettling in its intensity. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stepped closer, my hand reaching out for the doorknob. But before I could touch it, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the soft buzzing of an old machine. I froze. The sound came from inside the room, almost as if it was coming from the light itself. I pushed the door open. Inside the room, everything seemed frozen in time. The furniture, old and covered in dust, stood undisturbed. A single chair in the center of the room, facing the window. The light, bright and unwavering, poured through the glass. But there was something else. On the floor, near the chair, was something I hadn't expected. It was a phone. My phone. I recognized it immediately. The cracked screen, the chipped edges. It was the one I had lost months ago, the one I had searched for endlessly but never found. How had it gotten here? I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The buzzing sound grew louder, more insistent, like the phone was trying to call out to me. I bent down, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. And then, it happened. The phone screen flickered to life, the display showing my name. No, it wasn't just my name. It was the last message I had received months ago. The one I had never been able to erase. Where are you? I froze. The message was from me. It was from the past. The room felt colder, and the light flickered again. The buzzing intensified, filling the room with a low hum. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. This wasn't just a phone. This wasn't just a lost object. There was something wrong with this house, something wrong with the light. And then, as if it had been waiting for me, the door slammed shut behind me. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that left my heart pounding in my chest. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The room was still, silent, save for the low hum coming from the phone on the floor. It was as though the entire house had taken a deep breath and held it, waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. The buzzing sound from the phone continued, and I felt drawn to it, as if it were calling me. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. My mind raced with questions. How had the phone ended up here? And why was it showing a message from me? The screen flickered again, and the message blinked once more. Where are you? I knelt down slowly, my fingers brushing against the cracked edges of the phone. It felt oddly warm, like it had just been used. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. The last time I remembered seeing this phone, it had slipped between the cushions of my couch. I had searched for it everywhere, retraced every step, but it was gone. Gone, as if it had never existed. But here it was, in this room, in this abandoned house. The room that seemed frozen in time. I glanced around, my pulse quickening. There was something wrong with this place. The air was too still, too thick. Every corner of the room seemed to be watching me. The light from the window poured in, but it was no longer comforting. It felt alien, unnatural. It cast long, sharp shadows that twisted and stretched across the floor like fingers reaching out. The hum from the phone grew louder, now almost a steady pulse. My fingers brushed the screen again, and the message changed. You shouldn't have come. I recoiled, my heart skipping a beat. The message seemed to burn into my mind. I pulled my hand back, but I couldn't stop staring at it. The phone was now vibrating slightly, as if it were alive. I wanted to pick it up, to turn it off, but something held me back. The strange feeling of being watched, of being inside something, made it impossible to move. Then, I heard it. A faint sound, like a soft shuffling, coming from the corner of the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty chair facing the window, the dust-covered furniture, and the endless silence. The light flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I turned back to the phone. The screen had changed again. It's too late. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, wrapping itself around me. The walls seemed to close in, the floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with a growing sense of dread. The door, the one I had entered through, was still shut, but I could hear something now. A low, dragging sound, like something or someone was moving behind it. My mind screamed for me to leave, to run out of the house and never look back, but my body was frozen. The phone had become a strange anchor, its glow pulling me in, its hum vibrating through my chest. Then, the shadows near the chair moved. I turned sharply, my heart hammering in my chest. The chair was still there, but now, the shadows around it were shifting, stretching unnaturally. A figure, dark and indistinct, seemed to form out of the darkness, just beyond the edge of the light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with its silence. The figure remained still, watching me. "You shouldn't have come," the message on the phone repeated. My legs finally obeyed. I stumbled backward, my body reacting before my mind could fully grasp what was happening. I reached for the door, but the figure, no, the shadow, shifted closer, its form becoming more solid with every passing second. I yanked at the door handle. It was locked. The door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me, my pulse racing as I turned back to face the room. The shadow was no longer just a figure in the corner. It was standing now, tall and twisted, its shape barely human, but something far darker. The light flickered again, casting it into sharp relief for a moment, its hollow eyes staring at me, its long arms reaching toward me as if to drag me into the darkness. The buzzing from the phone intensified. The light from the window flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The shadow loomed, the room felt like it was closing in, and the phone was the only thing that seemed to be alive, pulsing in my hands, its message growing clearer. "You're not supposed to be here." I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, my mind spinning. I had to escape. I had to leave. But my legs felt weak, and I was trapped by the phone, trapped by the light, trapped by the thing that now filled the room with its presence. The shadows were moving faster now, swirling around the edges of the room, pulling at the light. The temperature dropped. The hum of the phone was deafening, almost drowning out everything else. "It's too late," it whispered again. And then, for the briefest of moments, the light from the window flickered one last time, and in that flash, the figure lunged. I didn't have time to think. Instinct took over. I turned and sprinted toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow, that thing, was close now, too close. It reached out with long, twisted arms, its fingers just inches from my back. The phone buzzed violently in my hand, as if urging me to run faster. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the buzzing, louder than my own breath. I slammed into the door with my shoulder, desperately twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I hit it again, and again, each time harder than the last, but it held fast. The shadow was right behind me now, so close I could feel the cold emanating from it, seeping into my bones. Panic surged within me. I was going to die here, trapped in this room, with no way out. The light flickered again, casting the room into stuttering darkness, then back into brightness. Each flash felt like a countdown, like the room itself was closing in, threatening to swallow me whole. I had to get out. I had to find another way. My eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape. The window was still open, though the blinds were half closed, hiding what lay beyond. It was a long drop, but I didn't care. I was running out of options, running out of time. I stumbled toward the window, my fingers gripping the sill, but as I pulled the blinds aside, I saw something I hadn't expected. A face staring back at me through the glass. I gasped, recoiling as my hand trembled over the window latch. The face on the other side was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes and a vacant stare. It was a face I didn't recognize, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it. I knew that face. I had seen it before. I froze. The shadow was still behind me, and the phone in my hand buzzed once more, louder, almost deafening. The face in the window seemed to move, shifting ever so slightly, as though it were trying to break through the glass. The chill from the window seeped into my fingertips, and for a moment, the air around me seemed to freeze. "You shouldn't have come," the phone whispered. I couldn't breathe. The words were like a punch to the gut. I turned away from the window, looking around the room in desperation. The shadows were closing in again, thicker now, swirling together, moving like a storm. The door was still locked, and the only escape seemed to be the face outside the window, but I couldn't understand why it was there, why it was waiting. And then, everything stopped. The hum from the phone died away, the shadows stilled. The light in the room flickered one final time, and for a moment, everything went dark. I felt the sudden shift in the air, a strange weight that pressed down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't just the cold, it was something deeper, something that felt wrong. And then, I heard it. A voice. "It's not just the house," the voice said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was more like a whisper, a murmur that echoed inside my skull. I whirled around, but there was no one. The room was empty. The shadow was gone. The phone had gone silent. And yet, the feeling remained. A presence. A weight. I turned back to the window, the face still staring at me through the glass. This time, I didn't recoil. Instead, I stepped closer, pressing my palm against the cool glass. The face didn't move, didn't change, but its eyes, those hollow, vacant eyes, seemed to see me. They bored into mine, as if they were searching for something, something buried deep inside me. I couldn't look away. The phone buzzed again, its screen flashing, but this time, the message was different. "You've seen too much." I flinched, the words sinking into my mind like a nail being driven into my skull. I tried to push the phone away, but it felt connected to me. It wasn't just a device. It was part of the puzzle. Part of whatever this place was. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. The light above flickered once more, casting a strange glow that seemed to intensify by the second. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen was moving around me. I glanced at the phone again, the message still glowing on the screen, but it was no longer about the window, or the shadow, or even the house. It was about me. "You can't escape what you found." I shook my head, my hand shaking as I dropped the phone to the floor. It clattered against the old wood with an eerie finality. I could hear it buzzing, vibrating as if in protest, but I didn't pick it up again. The room felt colder now, colder than it had been before, and the shadows were returning, slowly creeping along the walls, stretching toward me like fingers. They were alive. I could feel them. And then, as if the house itself were waking up, the floor beneath me shifted. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. The house was groaning, like it was alive, like it had been waiting for something, waiting for me to uncover its secret. I turned to face the door again, the door that had trapped me once already. The handle was cold beneath my hand. I twisted it again, this time with more force, but it didn't open. The rumbling grew louder. The walls began to close in. The shadows thickened, pressing toward me, grasping at me. I was running out of time. But then, a thought cut through the panic. What if I wasn't supposed to leave? The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity. What if I wasn't supposed to leave? I stood frozen, my hand still on the cold door handle. The house around me seemed to shift, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to come to this realization. The rumbling sound grew louder, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat reverberating through the floor. The walls creaked and groaned, as if they, too, were alive. The shadows were no longer just dark spots on the walls. They had mass, they had substance. They stretched toward me like dark fingers, curling and twisting in the corners of the room, waiting for something, waiting for me. And then, I understood. This house wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a place filled with creaking floors and shifting shadows. It was alive, aware, and somehow it had been waiting for me. The phone, the face in the window, the messages, it was all leading me here. To this moment. To this realization. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air rush into my lungs. The phone on the floor had gone silent, its buzzing faded into nothing, but the eerie weight of its presence lingered. I needed to confront whatever this was. I needed to understand why I was here, why this house seemed to pull at me. Slowly, I turned away from the door and looked toward the window. The face was still there, staring at me. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into mine, and I felt a deep sense of recognition, as though I had known this face my entire life. It wasn't a stranger's face. It was my own. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The face in the window wasn't just any face, it was me, but not the me I knew. It was a version of myself that had been twisted, distorted, broken. The eyes were vacant, like empty sockets, and the skin was pale, almost translucent. There was no life in it. Just emptiness. I couldn't look away. My heart pounded in my chest. I was too terrified to move, yet too drawn to the face to break my gaze. The rumbling beneath my feet grew louder, shaking the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. The shadows closed in on me, now more like a living, breathing presence than mere darkness. The phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't a message. It was a sound, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. It wasn't a call, it was a summoning. My hands shook as I reached for the phone again. It was as if the device had a mind of its own, pulling me toward it. I knelt down, picking it up slowly, afraid of what I might see. The screen was cracked, but the message that appeared was clear. You can never leave. The words were a final warning, a confirmation of what I already knew. I had stumbled into something that could not be undone. The house, the phone, the face, everything had been waiting for me. And now, it was too late. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath in front of me, swirling like smoke. The room seemed to darken, as if the shadows were eating away at the light itself, swallowing everything whole. I could feel the presence closing in around me, could hear the low hiss of something moving in the dark. I turned back to the window. The face was still there, but now it had moved. It wasn't just staring anymore, it was smiling. A twisted, grotesque grin stretched across its face, one that wasn't mine. I stepped backward, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were everywhere, wrapping around me, suffocating me, pulling at my feet. The walls seemed to shift, bending in ways they shouldn't. The house itself felt like it was folding inward, narrowing, closing off every escape. The rumbling became deafening, the sound of the house groaning in agony. The phone buzzed again, louder now, almost painfully so. I clutched it in my hand, my fingers aching, my thoughts a blur. You have nowhere to run. I could feel it, the house, closing in on me, suffocating me. The walls were pressing in tighter with each passing second, the air growing colder, the shadows closing in like a vice. I felt the very ground beneath me shift, as if the house itself were alive and moving, shifting its weight, ready to swallow me whole. And then, in a final burst of clarity, I understood the truth. The house wasn't trying to trap me. It was trying to take me. The phone fell from my hands as I backed away, my mind spinning. The shadows were all around me now, swallowing the light, wrapping around me like ropes, pulling me down. The house was alive, yes, but it wasn't just a house. It was something older, something far darker. And I had walked right into its grasp. I was part of it now. I could feel the house inside me, its cold, aching presence seeping into my bones, into my soul. It wasn't just the walls or the shadows, it was everything. It was me, and I was it. The line between us had blurred. I was trapped, and I would never escape. And as the darkness closed in, I heard it one last time, the whisper of the house, its voice as cold and ancient as the walls themselves. You were always meant to stay. I couldn't breathe. The cold, thick shadows coiled around me, tighter with every breath I took. The walls, once distant and unyielding, now pressed in on me like living things, their pulse synchronized with the beating of my heart. I could feel them, could hear them, moving, swaying, shifting around me. The air itself had become dense, suffocating, as if the very house had come alive, wrapping me in its embrace. I tried to scream, but my voice didn't come. The phone, now lifeless on the floor, flickered one last time before going completely dark. The buzzing was gone, and with it, any hope I had of escaping this nightmare. There was no exit now. No way to outrun this thing, this presence that had woven itself into my very being. I turned, desperate, searching for something, anything, that could help me. The window was still there, the face still staring back at me, though now it was a blur, its features distorted by the growing darkness. The smile, once grotesque, had twisted into something far more unsettling, a grin that stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face in two. It was my face. But it wasn't me. It was someone else. Someone that had been here long before I ever arrived. I reached out, not knowing why, my hand trembling as I touched the glass. The chill from the window seeped through my skin, making my bones ache, sending a wave of ice through my veins. It was cold. So cold. But it wasn't the cold of the night. It was the cold of the past. A whisper filled the room, low, deep, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but somehow it felt as if it had always been there, buried deep inside me, waiting to be heard. It's too late. The words didn't come from the window or the phone, but from within me, echoing through my thoughts, my memories. The house had always been this way. It had always been. I tried to pull away, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The shadows clung to me, pulling me closer to the glass. The window had become a portal, an opening to something darker, deeper, something that had been hidden for years, perhaps for lifetimes. The air around me grew thick with a terrible pressure. It was like the weight of the entire world was pushing down on me, and I couldn't escape. I couldn't move. I was trapped. The face in the window was no longer just staring. It was moving now, its twisted features warping and reshaping until it wasn't a face at all, but a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The room spun, the world around me shifting as if reality itself was bending, breaking. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold glass, and the world snapped. I was falling. There was no floor beneath me, no walls, no house. Only darkness, darkness that stretched endlessly, swallowing everything. I fell through it, weightless, for what felt like an eternity. Time had no meaning. The shadows, those endless, suffocating shadows, pulled me deeper, faster, until I couldn't tell if I was still falling or if I was suspended in some twisted void. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. I was standing again. I wasn't in the room anymore. The house was gone. The shadows were gone. The window was gone. I was in a place I couldn't recognize, but I knew it was familiar. I knew this place, though it was distorted, warped in ways I couldn't explain. The air was thick with the same cold, the same weight. I could feel it pressing against me, suffocating me. But there was something else now. Something worse. Something that had followed me here. It was silent. Too silent. I looked around, but there was nothing to see, just the darkness. Not even a shadow to cling to. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My feet felt like they were stuck to the ground, as if the very earth had claimed me, holding me in place. And then, I heard it. A soft sound, like a breath being drawn in. A cold, ragged breath that came from somewhere in the darkness. You shouldn't have come. The voice was unmistakable. It was my own. But it wasn't me. The darkness around me stirred, and I felt a presence, something watching me, waiting for me to realize the truth. I was no longer in the house. I wasn't even in the same reality anymore. I had crossed into a place that had no name, no form. A place that existed outside of time and space. A place where the boundaries between what was real and what was not had dissolved. And in this place, I was not just the observer. I was the prisoner. The walls, if you could even call them walls, began to shift, like the shifting shadows in the room. They were moving, breathing, alive. And then, I heard it again. That soft, ragged breath. You were always meant to stay. The voice echoed through the void, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was everything. It was the house, the window, the shadows, the phone. It was the past and the future. It was a part of me, a part of this place. A part of the very fabric of this nightmare. I had never escaped. There was no way out. There never had been. And as the darkness consumed me completely, I realized the truth. I wasn't the one who had been trapped here. The house had been waiting for me. Waiting for me to finally see. I was never meant to leave. Have you ever had that feeling, like you're in a place you've been before, but everything's suddenly wrong? A place where every corner seems familiar, but the more you walk, the more you start to doubt if it's really the same? That's how I felt today. It started out like any other evening. I had just finished work and was heading home, my usual route taking me through quiet streets and past the old corner shop. The sky was a dull gray, a light drizzle making the pavement shimmer like it had been freshly washed. The familiar sounds of cars passing, distant voices, and the hum of streetlights filled the air. It was a peaceful evening, the kind I had experienced countless times before. But then something changed. At first, it was small, almost insignificant. A shop window I didn't remember seeing before, a street lamp flickering in a way I was sure hadn't happened earlier. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just tired or distracted. But as I walked on, I noticed more things that didn't belong. The street I was walking down, I had walked down countless times. But now, it looked different. The buildings were there, yes, but they seemed wrong somehow. The windows were too dark, the bricks too chipped. The shapes of the houses were familiar, but the colors were off. It was like looking at a picture that had been warped, distorted. I turned a corner, expecting to see the park up ahead, but instead, there was an unfamiliar street. It didn't make sense. This wasn't part of my usual route. And yet, I could swear I had passed this very corner 1,000 times before. I stopped, confusion swirling in my chest. I had walked this way so many times, I could do it with my eyes closed. But now, my feet felt uncertain. I turned back, thinking I had simply missed a turn, but the street behind me was different too. The houses seemed smaller, more tightly packed together. The trees were twisted, their branches gnarled and unnatural, like they had grown in ways that defied reason. The quiet was oppressive. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced down at my phone. The map showed the same route I always took, but the streets weren't matching up. Something was wrong. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe I was just tired, or maybe the rain was playing tricks on my eyes. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lost. How could I be lost in a place I knew so well? I checked the time. It was getting late, and I needed to get home. I was just a few blocks away, or so I thought. The city I lived in was small, easy to navigate. But now, every street seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't understand. Buildings that I knew like the back of my hand were gone, replaced by unfamiliar structures. The shapes of the streets blurred into one another, as if the very city was reshaping itself. The further I walked, the more unnerving it became. It wasn't just that the streets had changed, it was as though the entire atmosphere had shifted. The air grew colder, and a strange silence settled over everything. No cars passed by anymore. No people walked the streets. The world around me felt suspended, like a moment frozen in time. I turned another corner, hoping for something, anything, that felt familiar, but instead, I found myself standing in front of a building I had never seen before. It was tall, looming over me like a dark monument to something I didn't understand. The windows were dark, the door cracked open, like it was waiting for me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a pull towards it. Something deep inside me urged me to go closer, to step inside. But then, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a rustle or a whisper, coming from behind the building. I froze, my heart racing. I couldn't make out the sound, but it was something. Something wasn't right. I turned away from the building and began to walk faster, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the street. I needed to get out of here. I needed to get home. But no matter which way I turned, the streets only led me deeper into the unknown. The city had shifted around me, trapping me in a maze of strange streets and empty buildings. The familiar had become foreign, the reality I knew now felt as if it were unraveling. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something that made my heart stop. It was a figure, standing in the middle of the street, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. It wasn't a person I recognized, but somehow, I knew it. It was as if I had seen this person before, but at the same time, I had never seen them at all. I stood there, frozen, unable to move as the figure slowly began to walk toward me. The footsteps echoed, sharp and deliberate, on the damp pavement. My skin prickled with unease, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. This wasn't right. This wasn't real. I turned, desperate to leave, but the streets ahead of me were just as unfamiliar as the one I had come from. The city had swallowed me whole, and now I had no idea how to get out. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into a place I couldn't escape from, a place that twisted reality and made everything seem wrong. And yet, I couldn't stop walking. The figure was still coming closer. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I could hear nothing else. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. My mind screamed at me to move, but it felt as though my body had betrayed me. With every step the figure took, the air seemed to grow thicker, colder. The familiar sounds of the city, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, had vanished completely. The only sound now was the slow, rhythmic tapping of its footsteps. The closer it got, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. The figure, though it resembled a person, felt like something other. Its movements were unnatural, too smooth, too fluid, as though it were gliding rather than walking. The street light above flickered, casting shadows that made it impossible to distinguish its features. Then, just as the figure was about to reach me, it stopped. I didn't dare move, didn't dare blink. My whole body was frozen, my eyes wide, watching the figure as it stood still in the dark. And then, in a voice that sounded both distant and as if it were right beside me, it spoke. Lost? I could barely breathe. The voice was my own, but it wasn't mine. It was warped, twisted, like an echo from somewhere deep inside my mind. I took a step back, the cold air biting at my skin. Who are you? I asked, my voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and began to walk away. The echo of its footsteps faded as it moved down the street, vanishing into the dark, swallowed by the shadows of the unfamiliar city. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. Was it real? Had I imagined it? Had I been standing there for minutes, hours, or just seconds? I didn't know. I only knew I had to keep moving. I had to find my way out. I took a hesitant step forward, glancing around at the street once more. The buildings around me were dark and silent, their windows vacant. The street itself seemed to stretch on, an endless road with no turning back. I could see no signs, no familiar landmarks. Everything was wrong, twisted into something that felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I checked my phone again. The map still showed my usual route, but the streets were completely unrecognizable. I had been walking for so long now, it felt as though I had gone in a circle, yet every corner I turned was met with unfamiliar sights. The air felt heavier now, as though the city was closing in around me, suffocating me with its emptiness. I needed to get home. I needed to make sense of this. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I felt that nothing was making sense. My mind was telling me this was all real, but my senses were screaming at me that something wasn't right. I was still in my city, but it had become a twisted, distorted version of itself. The world I had known was gone, replaced by something far darker, far more hostile. I walked faster now, my footsteps quickening as I glanced nervously over my shoulder. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay in this place. I could feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. The shadows seemed to shift, watching my every move. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, suffocating until I could hardly breathe. I turned yet another corner, hoping to find something, anything, that might bring me back to the familiar. But as I stepped into a new street, I felt it again. That strange disorientation. The sense that I had been here before, but it was wrong, so wrong. There was a street sign ahead, but when I reached it, I blinked and looked again. It wasn't the sign I thought I had seen. The letters had shifted, the words weren't right. The name of the street, if it had ever had a name, was now illegible, as if the very reality around me had begun to erase itself. I grabbed at my phone again, hoping to find some clarity, some way out of this nightmare. But when I opened the map, the screen was blank. There were no streets, no routes, no home. Just an empty space. The phone slipped from my hand, and I barely caught it before it hit the ground. My hands were trembling. I looked up again. The street was still the same, dark, silent, but now it seemed longer. The buildings had shifted further back, and I was standing at the edge of a vast, open space. There were no more houses, no more streets. Just a vast, empty void stretching out before me. A place I didn't recognize. And then I heard it. A soft, faint noise. Almost imperceptible at first. It was a whisper, but it wasn't a voice I could place. It wasn't coming from behind me or from the empty space ahead. It was coming from inside my head. Keep going. I froze. The voice, if you could even call it a voice, was not mine. But it was familiar. It was like hearing a memory, a forgotten thought, creeping back into my consciousness. Keep going. I looked around. No one was there. The street was as empty as it had been before. And yet, I felt it again, the pull. A force, cold and relentless, urging me forward, pulling me deeper into this strange place, this world that had become something unrecognizable. There was no turning back now. The whispering voice seemed to echo in my head, but it was distant, as though it had come from far off. I shook my head, trying to clear it. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Keep going, the voice urged again, this time with more force. It felt like it was inside me, pushing me forward, dragging me through the streets that were no longer streets at all. I hesitated. There had to be some explanation for all of this, some rational reason. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I was hallucinating. But the feeling in my chest told me that whatever was happening wasn't just in my mind. It felt real, too real. I forced myself to take a step, then another. My legs felt heavy, as if the air itself was thickening around me. But no matter how slowly I walked, it felt as if the ground stretched endlessly ahead. My heart raced as I moved deeper into the unfamiliar place. The buildings that loomed overhead were distorted, their shapes wrong in ways that made my stomach churn. They didn't just look odd, they felt oppressive, like they were alive, watching, waiting. The streets, if you could still call them that, seemed endless. I turned every corner and saw only more darkness, more looming facades that offered no escape. The quiet was unnerving. The world had fallen completely still, but the silence carried a weight that made the air seem thick, suffocating. And then I saw it. Up ahead, bathed in the weak light of a broken street lamp, was a figure. It was standing completely still, facing away from me. At first, I thought it might be the same figure from earlier, but as I got closer, I realized this one was different. It wasn't gliding like the last one had, but standing upright as if waiting. I wanted to turn around, to run back in the opposite direction, but something held me in place. My feet felt glued to the ground, my body frozen with fear. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. When I was close enough, the figure turned. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted its head to face me. It was a man, at least, he looked like one. But his face was obscured by a black hood that swallowed his features. His posture was rigid, like a statue, as though he wasn't even alive. But I could sense something in the air, something off about him. His presence seemed to distort the air around him, bending the space in subtle ways that made my mind ache. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice calm but chilling. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I could only stare at him, my throat tight with the pressure of the moment. Who was he? What was he doing here? "You're not supposed to be here," he repeated, his voice now sharper, more insistent. His words carried a weight, as if they were commanding, forcing me to hear them. I stepped back, my legs unsteady. But the man didn't move. His body remained unnervingly still, except for his eyes. His eyes, or where his eyes should have been. They weren't empty, but glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "Why am I here?" I'd finally managed to ask, but words escaping me in a breathless whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to consider my question, as if weighing my existence in this place. Then he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "This place is a bridge between the real and the forgotten," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "You are lost, and this is where lost things go." I didn't understand. The words made no sense. My mind tried to grasp the meaning, but it slipped through my fingers like sand. "I'm not lost," I said, my voice shaking with uncertainty. "I'm just trying to get home. This can't be real." The man tilted his head, and I saw a flicker of something dark, pass behind his eyes. "You think this is an accident? That your steps have led you here by chance?" "No, you've been drawn here. This city does not let go once you enter." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean? What city?" "This is my city." He took a step closer, his feet making no sound on the pavement, as if his presence was somehow silencing the world around him. "Not anymore. Not since you started walking down this path." My head spun. The ground beneath me felt unstable. I had to leave. I had to find a way out of this place that was becoming less real with every passing second. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My feet moved before my brain had fully processed the decision. I sprinted down the street, away from the man, away from the terrifying weight of his presence. The air around me was heavy and thick, as if pushing against me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't look back. The streets blurred around me, the buildings warping and distorting as I ran. It was as if the city itself was stretching and shifting, changing shape with every turn I took. The once familiar roads now felt alien, like I was running through a nightmare, unable to escape. I stumbled forward, my heart pounding. I had to get out. I had to find something that made sense. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, I heard it, the faintest sound, so soft it almost didn't seem real. A voice, distant and cold, whispered from the darkness. "You can't run from this." I stopped dead in my tracks, the words sinking into my chest like stones. I turned slowly, my body trembling. But the figure, the man, was gone. In his place, the street was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. Had I imagined him? Was it all just a hallucination? But even as I stood there, staring at the empty street, I could feel it, the wrongness, the distortion in the air. Something was still out of place. And then I saw it. At the end of the street, standing in the dim light, was a figure. A shadowy outline, a silhouette of a person, waiting. I didn't run this time. I couldn't move. It was like something in the air had frozen me, trapping my feet in place. The figure stood at the end of the street, a dark outline against the dim glow of the distant streetlights. It was familiar, yet wrong, its presence both unsettling and oddly comforting, like a memory you can't quite place. The longer I stared, the more I felt the pull of it, drawing me toward it, dragging me like a magnet to steel. I forced myself to blink, trying to shake off the paralyzing fear. But my body remained still, unyielding to my will. And then the figure moved. Slowly at first, just a shift of the shoulders, a turn of the head. But with every subtle movement, it felt as though the city itself responded. The buildings groaned and shifted in the corner of my vision, their shapes bending like shadows. The sound of the wind began to rise, a soft, whistling hum, as if the city were breathing. The figure's movements became more deliberate, and it started walking toward me. My heart pounded as I forced my legs to move. I needed to get away. This was wrong. Everything about this place was wrong. But no matter how fast I tried to walk, it felt like I was being pulled back, like the space between us was shrinking faster than I could cover it. I stumbled, my breath coming in short gasps. The ground felt uneven underfoot, as though I were walking on a surface that didn't quite exist. My foot brushed something soft, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. The figure stopped just before me, its face still obscured by the black hood. The glow in its eyes was dimmer now, but there was something almost comforting about it, a cold reassurance, as if it knew everything about me. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice smooth and mechanical, like a distant echo. I'm not lost," I stammered, though I knew I was. "I'm just trying to get home." The figure tilted its head. "Home? This city is not your home anymore. You're a guest here now, and guests do not leave." I took another step back, my heart thundering in my chest. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. I had to wake up. I had to snap out of it, but the air around me felt so thick, like I was suffocating under its weight. The figure took a step forward, and I froze. "You don't belong here," it repeated, but its voice was different now, softer, almost pitying. "You've walked too far. The city knows your steps. The city knows my steps." What did that even mean? What city? This couldn't be my city. It was a place I didn't recognize, a place that didn't make sense. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling. The figure raised a hand, motioning toward the streets that stretched out endlessly in both directions. "This is the City of Echoes. A place between places, a world between worlds, where memories of the past, the present, and the future all blur together. A place for those who stray too far." I shook my head. "No, this isn't real. This is just a dream." "You're awake," the figure said. "But you've crossed a line. And now you must face the consequences." I took a step back, feeling panic rise in my chest. "I don't belong here," I said desperately. "I'm just trying to go home." the figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped aside, gesturing toward the street behind me. The street I had come down. I turned, my body moving of its own accord. The street was no longer the same. The buildings were warped and distorted, as though the entire city had shifted in the time I'd spent with the figure. The path I had walked just minutes ago was now unfamiliar, a twisting, claustrophobic alleyway leading deeper into the heart of this place. The whispering voice from before, soft and urgent, returned to my ears. "You cannot turn back." I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. I could feel the city's grip tightening around me, the walls closing in, the streets bending and twisting, drawing me deeper into its maze. "Why is this happening?" I whispered, but there was no answer. The city was silent now, except for the low hum of the wind. I stumbled forward, fighting the unseen force that pressed down on me, pushing me toward the darkened alley. My thoughts raced. I had to find a way out. There had to be an exit, a way back to the world I knew. But with every step I took, the sense of disorientation grew. The buildings felt closer now, their faces unreadable, their windows blank like eyes that watched without ever blinking. The air grew thick with the scent of something burning, a faint, acrid smell that made my stomach turn. And then, at the end of the alley, I saw something that made my heart freeze. There was a door. It looked like an ordinary door. Plain, weathered, with a brass handle that seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place. But it wasn't just the door that caught my attention, it was the reflection in the glass. I was there, standing on the other side of the door, staring back at myself. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the glass. The reflection mirrored my movements, but something was off. My reflection smiled. It shouldn't have been smiling. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away from the door, my chest tightening. The door, the reflection, none of it made sense. But as I turned to run, I felt the presence behind me. The figure had followed me, standing just behind, its hooded face inches from mine. It whispered in my ear, its voice cold as ice. "You cannot run from yourself." And in that moment, I realized that the city was not the thing trapping me. It was me. I was the one who had wandered too far, who had left the path behind, and now there was no escape. The door was only the beginning. I had become part of the echo. I could feel the walls of the city closing in around me, suffocating me with their weight. My reflection, the version of me that stood on the other side of the door, smiled again, that eerie, twisted grin frozen on its face. The more I stared at it, the more I felt like I was losing touch with myself, like the boundaries of who I was were blurring with the thing I was becoming. I turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. The sound of my own breathing was the only thing I could hear now, shallow and fast, as I stumbled through the darkening streets. The city's grip on me was unrelenting, its pathways twisting and stretching in impossible ways. The road I had walked just moments ago now felt like a distant memory, as if the city had reshaped itself to trap me. I couldn't trust my senses. Every corner I turned led to more dead ends, more strange alleyways that felt like they were repeating themselves. No matter how many times I retraced my steps, I always ended up at the same place, the door. The door that had shown me my reflection, the version of me I couldn't escape. "You cannot run from yourself," the figure's words echoed in my mind, like a constant, maddening hum. I didn't know how much longer I could take this endless loop of confusion, the suffocating sense of being lost in a place that was both familiar and alien. I couldn't keep going in circles. I had to face whatever this was. I took a deep breath, my body trembling with fear, and I turned back to the door. This time, I didn't look at the reflection. I didn't want to see what had changed. I knew that if I kept running, it would only pull me further into its grip, its maze. I reached for the brass handle, its coldness biting at my palm. With a steadying breath, I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. It didn't feel like an escape, but I had no other choice. There was no going back to the world I had known. I stepped through. The instant I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The tension that had gripped me loosened just for a moment. The hum of the city, the whispers, and the pressing weight of it all faded into the distance. The door behind me slammed shut with a finality that sent a chill through my spine. I stood in what seemed like an endless void. No streetlights, no buildings, no sounds, nothing but an all-encompassing silence. I was alone. But was I? I turned slowly, and there, standing before me, was the figure once more. It was no longer looming in the shadows, no longer a distant shape. It was right in front of me, standing in the middle of the void, its dark hood barely concealing its face. "You've come back," it said, its voice soft but filled with something deeper, something older. I swallowed hard. "Where am I?" The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head as if contemplating the question. Then, with an almost gentle motion, it reached out, brushing a finger against my cheek. The touch was cold, sending a shock through my body. "You've crossed the line, but this place is where all lines meet," it said quietly. "This is where the past, present, and future are woven together. It's where you're meant to be, even if you don't understand why." I shook my head, my mind spinning. I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere. I just wanted to get home. The figure nodded slowly, its eyes glowing faintly, the only source of light in the endless darkness. "Home," it repeated. "The thing you seek. But home is not a place. It's a journey. And yours has only just begun." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "What do you want from me?" The figure's gaze softened, almost sorrowful. "What do you want from yourself?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know. All I knew was that the world I had left behind no longer made sense. This place, this endless void, this echo of reality had become my new home. And yet, it was not a home at all. It was a prison, a place where I couldn't escape my own reflection, my own choices, my own fear. I stepped back, the weight of the figure's words sinking in. I couldn't stay here. I had to find a way out. I had to return to the life I once knew, even if it was just an illusion. But the figure raised a hand, stopping me. "There is no return. Not anymore. You can walk away from this place, but the city will always follow you. It knows you now, knows your steps, knows your thoughts." I looked around, trying to make sense of the nothingness surrounding me. There was no way out, no clear path back. The door had vanished, leaving me stranded in this limbo. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, paralyzed by the weight of it all. But eventually, the figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence. "You are free to go," it whispered. "But remember, nothing truly leaves you. You are part of this place now." And with that, the figure was gone. I was alone again. But this time, I didn't feel the crushing weight of fear. The silence that surrounded me wasn't as oppressive. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain: I had to move forward, no matter how much it hurt. I took a step, then another, and then I began walking into the unknown. And as I walked, I felt the world shift beneath my feet. The city, the reflections, the echoes, it was all still there, lingering just beneath the surface. But I wasn't running anymore. I was facing it, step by step, as it faded into the distance. And for the first time, I didn't feel lost. Have you ever wondered if your life has already been written? That your choices aren't really yours, but just echoes of something someone else has penned long before you even knew what to do with your days? I often find myself thinking about it lately. It's strange how life seems to twist and bend around you, as if it's not entirely your own. How much of what we do is truly our decision? What if the decisions we think are ours were already decided for us? It started with a discovery. A discovery I never expected to make in a place where I had always felt safe. My own home, my study, the very desk I've spent countless hours at, writing stories. I've been a writer for years, and yet, something about that evening felt different. The air was thick, almost electric, like the world was holding its breath. I had been working on a novel, a story I had been piecing together for months. I'd already written the beginning, the middle, and most of the ending. But there was one part of the story I hadn't finished. A section that haunted me. I couldn't quite figure out how to end it. I wanted it to be meaningful, but it wasn't coming together. My characters, the world they inhabited, it was all incomplete. So, I did what I always did when I was stuck. I took a break. I grabbed a cup of tea and sat back, letting the silence of my study calm my mind. The faint ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound that accompanied me. I thought about the story, about what I could do to finally bring it to a close. The ending would be crucial. It would tie everything together, give the characters their resolution, and answer the questions that had been building for months. As I sipped my tea, I noticed something odd. One of the pages in my manuscript, the one I had been working on earlier, was missing. I was sure it had been there when I left my desk, but now there was a gap between the pages. My heart skipped a beat. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of it. Maybe I had misplaced it. Maybe it had fallen somewhere. I didn't think much of it and resumed my work. But then I found it. It wasn't on the floor, nor was it among the clutter on my desk. Instead, it was on top of the manuscript, resting neatly, as if it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up, frowning in confusion. It wasn't a page I had written. At least, not one I recognized. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, precise, yet unnervingly similar to my own. I turned the page over. The words on it were perfectly clear, like they had always been there. It wasn't just an addition to the manuscript, it was the conclusion, the ending I had been searching for. But it wasn't just any ending. It was the ending that mirrored my life. Every detail, every word, felt as though it was describing the future. The characters, my characters, were facing a crisis, something I had never written about, but which I had been sensing for weeks now. The story was unfolding exactly as I had been living it. The challenges, the doubts, even the smallest moments of my day were playing out on the page. How was this possible? How had this page, with this ending, found its way into my manuscript? I read it over and over again. The pages spoke of things that hadn't happened yet, but that I knew were going to happen. The strange sense of being watched, the eerie feeling that the world around me was changing in ways I couldn't quite understand. The final lines were chilling, and when the writer reaches the last page, he will discover that the story was never his to begin with. The end has already been written. My mind raced. How could this be? I had written everything up to that point, but I had never written this. I hadn't even thought of it. And yet, there it was, an undeniable part of my story. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was controlling me. What if the story I thought I was writing was just a reflection of something much darker? What if my life, the choices I thought were mine, were simply echoes of this plotline, unfolding like a puppet show? I stood up quickly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. My heart began to pound. Was I losing control of my own life? Was I trapped in a narrative I couldn't escape from? I looked around the room, but everything seemed the same. Nothing had changed. It was the same quiet study, the same warm light from the desk lamp, the same old clock ticking away in the corner. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. I glanced at the page once more, my hands trembling. The handwriting seemed to mock me. The page was still there, staring back at me, like an invitation I didn't want to accept. But I had to know. I had to understand how this could be. How had the end of my story been written before I had even realized it? I sank back into my chair, staring at the last line over and over again. The end had already been written. But who had written it? And why? The ticking of the clock was louder now. It seemed to echo in the room, a countdown that I couldn't ignore. Something was coming. Something I wasn't prepared for. The question I had been avoiding finally hit me like a jolt of electricity. What happens when the writer reaches the last page? I couldn't sleep that night. The words from the page haunted me, creeping into every corner of my mind. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the lines again, and when the writer reaches the last page, he will discover that the story was never his to begin with. The end has already been written. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it. It could have been a coincidence, some strange turn of events. Perhaps I had written it at some point and forgotten, or maybe it was just a fragment of a dream, an unsettling, surreal vision that found its way into my work. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't something I could simply brush off. It was too precise, too uncanny. The details in the story were too familiar. I didn't know how to face the morning. The sun had barely risen, yet my mind felt as if it had already been awake for hours, running through a dozen possible explanations and none of them making any sense. I needed to clear my head, to get away from the manuscript, but even as I sat down to have a cup of coffee, the unease persisted. Everything in my apartment looked ordinary, but it didn't feel ordinary. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of traffic from the street below, even the quiet tapping of my fingers against the mug, it all seemed to take on a new layer of meaning. Like every sound, every moment, was part of something much larger, something I couldn't control. I tried to convince myself that the manuscript was just a story, that nothing more could come of it. But as the day wore on, the sensation grew. I couldn't stop thinking about the last page. Every time I passed by the desk, I felt a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing me back to it. The manuscript was waiting for me. Finally, I gave in. I returned to the desk, my hands unsteady as I picked up the pages. The last page still lay on top, but now I noticed something else. A second page had appeared, slipping from between the other sheets, as if it had been hiding there all along. It was more of the same, a continuation of the story, the events of my life being chronicled in ways I had never expected. This time, the words were even more specific. They spoke of moments I had yet to experience, but that I could already feel in my bones. The page described my meeting with someone, a stranger, someone I would encounter soon. A brief exchange, seemingly inconsequential, but it would change everything. My pulse quickened as I read on. The page spoke of the unease that had been growing inside me, the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It described the quiet moments when I would be alone, when the weight of the world would press on my chest and make it difficult to breathe. But then, there was something more. The story hinted at a choice I would have to make, one that would determine my fate. The twist in the narrative was chilling. The very thing I feared was the one thing I would be forced to confront, and if I chose incorrectly, it would lead to an inevitable, inescapable conclusion. I slammed the manuscript shut, a wave of panic crashing over me. This wasn't just fiction. This was something else. The story was predicting my future. I could see the path laid out before me, and it terrified me. Was this my life unfolding on paper? Or was I merely a character in someone else's plot? I had to know more. I couldn't stop now. The page had left me with more questions than answers, but there was one thing I knew for certain: the story was not over. It had only just begun. The minutes felt like hours as I sat there, staring at the pages, trying to decide what to do next. I had to find out what came after the last page. What would the next chapter bring? But as I reached for the manuscript, something strange happened. The words on the page began to shift, as if they were moving before my eyes. The letters blurred, and I could hear a faint whispering sound, too soft to catch, but there nonetheless. I squinted, leaning closer to the paper, and that's when I saw it. The words weren't just changing, they were writing themselves in real time, new lines appearing as though someone was penning them before my very eyes. Panic rose in my chest. I pulled my hands away, but the words kept coming. They described me, sitting there at the desk, frozen in place, as the ink spread across the page. The figure in the story was now me. I wasn't just the writer anymore, I was the character. I had become part of the narrative. I looked up from the pages, my eyes wide with disbelief. The room around me felt different, as if the walls were closing in, as though the world was shifting. The sounds of my apartment, once so familiar, now seemed distant, muffled, as if I were no longer fully present in this reality. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I turned toward the door, but something held me back. A nagging sense that I was being drawn in, that I couldn't escape. I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. But there was no one there. No one in the hallway outside my door. I didn't know if I was hearing things, or if the story I had written was coming to life in ways I didn't understand. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever was happening, it wasn't under my control anymore. I looked back at the manuscript, now fully aware that my life was no longer just mine. I was trapped in the story. And it was only a matter of time before I reached the last page. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They echoed in the hall outside my apartment. I froze, my body stiff with tension. They weren't my footsteps. I hadn't moved, yet they came steadily closer. The air grew colder. I stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor in a sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I wasn't sure if I should open it, or if I should just hide, but the idea of doing nothing felt even more terrifying. The story had already begun to shape itself around me. I had become its captive audience. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever was coming next. I moved toward the door, my breath shallow. My hand trembled as it reached for the doorknob. It was as if the story had already predicted this moment. The cold, the footsteps, the feeling of dread. I had read about all of it, but it hadn't seemed real until now. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The light above flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. The silence was deafening. I stepped out cautiously, looking both ways. There was no one. Only the hum of the overhead light and the occasional creak of the building's old pipes. I exhaled sharply, relieved, though a strange sensation lingered, a tightness in my chest, as if something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes flicked down to the pages in my hand. They were still writing themselves. New words appeared, flowing seamlessly onto the page, as though they were determined to guide me through this unfolding nightmare. The next line caught my eye, chilling me to my core. He opened the door to find nothing but emptiness. But he knew, deep down, that he was not alone. I slammed the manuscript shut. The room seemed to spin. I was spiraling, sinking deeper into something I didn't understand. I stumbled back into the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I had to make a choice. The last page was inevitable, I realized. Whatever I did, however I acted, I was bound to follow the narrative that had already been written. It was no longer about the decisions I made, it was about whether I could accept my role in this story, or if I could somehow fight against it. I sat back down at my desk, my hands clenched around the manuscript. The whispers were louder now, indistinct murmurs filling my head. The clock ticked louder than before, every second stretching into eternity. I felt a sudden weight on my chest, as if the world was pressing in on me, as though the walls themselves were closing. There was something in the air, something wrong. And then I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room. It wasn't just the low light. This shadow was different. It moved, creeping slowly across the floor, stretching toward me. I could see the outline of a figure now. It wasn't quite human, yet not entirely an apparition. Its edges were blurred, like a dream half remembered, its form flickering as if it couldn't decide whether it was real or not. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. The shadows seemed to grow, its form becoming clearer, more defined. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Its voice was low and mechanical, like a distorted echo of my own thoughts. You cannot escape your story. The words came with a weight that seemed to press down on me, suffocating me with their inevitability. The manuscript was still in my hands. I couldn't stop myself from opening it. The words were already on the page, continuing the narrative. My actions, my thoughts, they were all being written for me. The figure in the room grew closer, its presence overwhelming. The writer had nowhere left to run. He had written himself into a corner. And now, the story would end just as it was meant to. I stared at the page, feeling a coldness wash over me. There was no way out. I had no choice. The figure, this presence, was the end of my story. I was staring at my own conclusion. But then something shifted. The shadow seemed to flicker, as if it was losing its grip on reality. I took a step back, still clutching the manuscript. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned the page. I knew I shouldn't have. I knew it was a mistake, but I did it anyway. The words were different now. The story was changing. It wasn't describing the scene in the same way anymore. I wasn't the victim of my own creation anymore. The figure in the room was no longer looming over me. It was retreating, fading. The writer made his choice. He no longer wrote just a story, he took control of it. And the end would no longer be written by someone else. I blinked. My heart pounded in my chest. What was happening? The story wasn't just following its own path anymore. It was changing, shifting under my will. I had written a way out. But how could that be possible? How could I rewrite the very thing that had been controlling me all this time? I looked up, and the figure was gone. The room was empty once again. But the manuscript in my hands, it was different. The ink was still wet on the page, but now the story was mine. I had rewritten my fate. The air was heavy with silence. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I glanced down at the manuscript in my hands. The words were still there, the ink fresh and dark. But now, it felt different. I had somehow shifted the course of the story. I couldn't quite explain how, but the room, my apartment, was quieter now. The oppressive weight, the tension, had lifted. The figure was gone. The shadows no longer stretched toward me. I stood up, feeling lightheaded, my mind still in a fog. What did it all mean? Was this a dream? Some kind of madness? The room was unchanged. The ticking of the clock was the only sound, but somehow it felt normal. Like I had never experienced the horror that had consumed me just moments ago. The pages in front of me were still being written, though slower now. Each word, each sentence, was still coming to life. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. But I had to know. I had to understand. What was this power that I now seemed to wield? I picked up my pen, a feeling of determination running through me. What would happen if I wrote something new? The thought felt strange, foreign. It was as if I had unlocked some forbidden door. I hesitated for a moment, but then I wrote. The room grew brighter, the shadows retreating into nothingness. And just like that, the room became brighter. The faint light from the window now seemed stronger, as if the sun itself had decided to break through the clouds. I blinked, feeling a surge of power, a sense of control that I had never experienced before. I wrote again. The clock's ticking slowed, then stopped altogether. I sat back, watching the second hand of the clock slowly freeze. The room was still. The only sound was the faint rustling of the manuscript in my hands, as if it was alive. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't trapped anymore. The story was no longer the author of my life. I was. For the first time, I felt like I could truly choose. I wasn't bound by fate. I could shape the world around me. But then, a voice pierced the silence. You cannot rewrite it all. The voice was cold, familiar. It was the voice of the figure, the shadow that had haunted me. I turned, my heart racing again, but there was nothing in the room. The figure was gone. I stood up, my legs unsteady. Who are you? I asked into the empty space. But there was no response, only the rustling of the pages in my hands. You know, the voice said again, its tone now quieter, almost wistful. You can't escape the final chapter. I paused. There it was again. The final chapter. The one I had always feared. The one that had already been written. I could feel the weight of those words, the inevitability of them. I glanced at the manuscript again. The final page, the one that I had never written, was still there, waiting. The words seemed to shimmer as if they were about to come to life. The last page would be the end of everything. I swallowed hard, a tightness forming in my throat. Was this my destiny? To be trapped in this never-ending loop of creation and destruction? The voice had been right. Perhaps I couldn't escape the final chapter. But then I remembered what I had done. I had changed the story before. I had rewritten my fate. Could I do it again? I grabbed the pen once more, a sense of resolve flooding through me. I wrote. The final page was never finished, for the writer had learned that there is always more to be written. The words felt different as they spilled onto the page, more powerful, more real. The ink seemed to glow, as if responding to my will. I had changed it. I had rewritten the end. The voice did not speak again. The air around me felt still, as though everything had come to a halt. The weight of the room, the tension, the darkness, they were all gone. I had taken control. I looked at the page, feeling a strange peace settle over me. I wasn't bound to a fate that had already been written. I had rewritten it. I had created my own path, my own future. The last page was no longer an end. It was a beginning. The room seemed to breathe with me now. I could hear the hum of the world outside, distant, faint, but it was there. For the first time in days, weeks, maybe even longer, I felt in control of my own fate. I had rewritten it. The page, once so insistent in its finality, now stretched before me, an open field waiting for my next move. I ran my fingers along the last line I had written. The final page was never finished, for the writer had learned that there is always more to be written. The words danced in my mind, repeating themselves like a mantra. The writer, the creator, the one who held the power over the narrative. But then, a question surfaced, insidious and undeniable. What if I was wrong? I looked at the manuscript again, the pages stretching out endlessly in front of me. Each one was filled with words that were both mine and not mine. I had written them, yes, but they had shaped me too. Every sentence, every line had become a part of me. The story had become a reflection of my soul. What if I had only delayed the inevitable? What if the final page, the one that had haunted me, was simply waiting for me to reach it again, no matter how many times I tried to rewrite it? The thought gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake it. Could I truly control the ending, or was I simply playing along with something greater? Something I couldn't understand? I felt the weight of those thoughts pressing on me, a suffocating darkness that began to creep back into the corners of my mind. I needed to know. I had to know. I stood up, pacing back and forth in the small apartment, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The world outside had grown quiet, as if it, too, was waiting for me to make my move. Could I change everything? Could I escape the fate I had written for myself? I walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The streets were empty. The lights flickered like distant stars. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if the world was no longer my own. I was merely an observer, watching it all from a distance. Then, I turned back to the manuscript. The final page stared up at me, its empty white surface mocking me, daring me to finish it. The ink was still fresh. Still waiting. But what would I write? Could I write? I reached for the pen again. This time, there was no hesitation. I knew what I had to do. I could no longer keep rewriting the ending, delaying the inevitable. The final page had to be written, not as a choice, but as a conclusion. I took a deep breath and wrote. And with that, the writer closed the manuscript, knowing that the story would never truly end, for the last page was always the beginning of something new. I felt the weight of the words settle into my chest. The page felt different this time, heavier, more real. I had written the conclusion, but in doing so, I had opened another door. The story, my story, could never truly end. It would continue, again and again, in ways I couldn't predict. As I set the pen down, I heard a sound, a soft tapping, like the rustling of pages. The room around me seemed to shimmer, as if the boundaries of the world were shifting, bending. The manuscript in my hands was no longer mine alone. It was alive. It was part of me, and I was part of it. The final page was not the end. It was simply the start of the next chapter. Have you ever felt someone's presence without them being there? That strange, chilling sensation that crawls up your spine like an unseen hand slowly brushing against your skin? I had it tonight. I was working late, as usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls of my small office. The hum of the computer was the only sound breaking the silence, and the occasional click of my mouse. It wasn't a bad night, quiet, uneventful. But there was something different. It happened while I leaned back in my chair, stretching for a moment. My eyes were fixed on the screen, but I felt it, the faintest touch. A hand on my left shoulder. For a split second, I froze, my muscles tensing in that instinctive way they do when something isn't right. It wasn't hard or aggressive. It wasn't like someone had grabbed me. It was just a presence, a light touch, almost like someone trying to get my attention. I turned, heart pounding, expecting to find one of my coworkers standing there, perhaps coming to chat or ask a question. But the space behind me was empty. The office door was closed, and the only sound now was the soft tap of my shoes against the tile as I slowly swiveled around in my chair. There was no one. I shrugged it off at first. It had to be nothing, right? Maybe a draft? A trick of the mind from being so exhausted. But then, I glanced at the security camera screen on the corner of my desk. It was a routine setup. The office had cameras for security, but it wasn't like we had much of a need for them at night. Still, something made me pause and look at the live feed. I couldn't explain it, but I had to check. Maybe the footage would help me make sense of what had just happened. I clicked on the feed for the camera behind me. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy black and white view of the office. At first, everything seemed normal. Empty chairs. A few scattered papers on the desk. Then, as the seconds ticked by, I saw it. A shadow. It started as a small distortion in the light, a blur just behind my chair, in the exact spot where I had felt the touch. For a moment, I thought it was just a glitch, perhaps the low light or a camera malfunction. But then, the shadow moved. It wasn't much, just a slight darkening in the shape of a figure, something human-shaped, though not quite right. And it was definitely behind me. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stayed in place for a moment, almost as if it were waiting. Then, it shifted again, the form becoming clearer, more distinct. It wasn't a blur. It wasn't a glitch. It was there. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. Just like that. The screen showed only the empty office behind me. My hand trembled as I reached for the mouse, pausing the feed. I stared at the still image, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of trick, that the shadow was nothing more than a trick of the lighting or the camera. But deep down, I knew. I had felt it. The hand on my shoulder. The presence behind me. And now, the shadow. I wasn't alone. And I couldn't explain why. I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see something, or someone standing in the corner of the office, waiting for me to look. But once again, the room was empty. I was still alone. The office felt colder now. The hum of the computer seemed more pronounced, like a sound I could hear in the very back of my skull. The lights flickered for a moment, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The stillness was oppressive, suffocating. I was beginning to doubt myself. Was I imagining things? Was I just overtired, the stress of work creeping into my mind? But the cold, clammy feeling on my shoulder, that touch, I couldn't deny it. I wasn't imagining it. I had to know what was happening. And I wasn't going to stay here alone to find out. But something told me that leaving wouldn't make it go away. The feeling was there, lurking just out of sight. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could still feel the weight of the presence behind me. Was it watching me now? I glanced back at the screen again, the security feed still paused. That shadow was gone, but what did that mean? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and grabbed my coat. I wasn't staying here. Not tonight. But as I stood up and turned toward the door, a new thought hit me. The shadow wasn't gone. It was still there, watching me from the edge of my mind, waiting for me to return. I didn't need the cameras to see that. I stepped out into the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The air felt thicker here, as though it were pressing against me, making every movement just a little more difficult. The building, normally quiet and empty at this hour, seemed alive in a way that was hard to explain. Every flicker of a light, every creak of the floorboards, sent a ripple of unease through me. I had to get out of here. I had convinced myself that whatever had happened back in the office was just a weird trick of the mind. Perhaps it was fatigue, or the stress of deadlines catching up with me. There was a logical explanation, surely. Shadows in an office building after dark could play tricks on anyone. But as I walked through the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart was thudding louder now, every step seeming to carry more weight than the last. I was almost at the stairs when I heard it. A soft shuffle. At first, I thought it was just my imagination again. Maybe the building was settling, or some distant noise I hadn't noticed before. But then, it came again. This time, clearer. Closer. A soft, dragging step, followed by another. I froze. The sound was unmistakable, the shuffle of feet against the floor. But there was no one there. No one I could see. I turned my head, trying to see down the hallway behind me, but it was dark. The kind of dark that made it hard to see beyond a few feet. I strained my eyes, listening intently, but the sound was gone. Had I imagined it? No. I was sure I hadn't. The tension in my chest grew tighter. Something was following me. I kept walking, trying to move faster, but the unsettling feeling grew with each step. I reached the staircase, the door to the outside world just one floor away. I was almost there. Almost safe. As I reached for the door, my eyes caught a glimpse of the security camera screen, still on my desk in the office. Without thinking, I stepped back and opened my phone, pulling up the live feed again. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to do it. Maybe I needed to see for myself that everything was fine. Maybe I just wanted some kind of reassurance. But as the camera feed loaded, my stomach dropped. There it was again, the shadow. This time, it was clearer. The same human-like form, but larger now. It loomed behind the desk, the shape more defined than before. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, like it was growing, expanding. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at the screen, transfixed by the figure. It wasn't moving this time. But somehow, I knew that it was aware of me watching. I could feel its presence in the pit of my stomach, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on me. Then the screen flickered. Just for a second. The shadow wasn't there anymore. The feed was blank. A chill swept over me. I knew I had to leave. It was clear now, something was wrong. Something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. I could feel it deep inside, this sense that I was not just dealing with an empty office or an overactive imagination. There was something else here, something I couldn't see, but that I could feel. I turned and pushed open the door to the stairwell, walking quickly now, my mind racing. I could hear my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Every muscle in my body was on high alert, every sense attuned to the silence around me. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the heavy metal door to the outside world just a few feet away. The sense of urgency overwhelmed me. I needed to get out of here. But just as I reached for the door handle, a voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered my name. Jason. I spun around, heart thundering in my chest. No one was there. The hallway was empty. I stood frozen, staring at the space where the voice had come from. There was no one there. But the voice had been real, as clear as anything I'd ever heard. It had come from right behind me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, my body tingled with dread. I could feel something, or someone, watching me. I could hear footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming closer from behind. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the building settling. I was being followed. My body acted before my mind could process it. I ran, not stopping to look back, not daring to even turn around to see who, or what, was behind me. The door slammed open with a force that startled me, and I stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The night was cool, the city quiet and still. I was outside. Safe, at least for now. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized something. The footsteps had stopped. The voice had stopped. I wasn't being followed anymore. But I knew one thing for certain. The feeling wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking, waiting. It had followed me out of the building, and now I could feel it creeping up my spine, closer and closer, just behind me, its breath on my neck. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I would never be able to escape it. I stood on the cold sidewalk, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts, but even the frigid night air couldn't shake the eerie sensation that something was still behind me. I kept my gaze straight ahead, eyes darting nervously to the corners of my vision, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The street was empty, the hum of distant traffic the only sound in the quiet night. I should have felt relief, right? I was outside now, away from the building, away from whatever it was that had been following me. But instead, an unsettling sense of being watched crawled up my skin. I couldn't escape the nagging thought that I wasn't alone. The footsteps that had been behind me earlier, they were gone. But the air still felt thick with something, as though the weight of the presence had followed me out into the open. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see nothing. But when I did, my heart skipped a beat. The street was still empty, but it didn't feel empty. It felt off. Like there was something just out of sight, something hiding in the shadows, waiting to reach out. I turned quickly, shaking the feeling off. I was being paranoid. I had to be. There was nothing there. Nothing at all. But then I heard it again. The whisper. Jason. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing straight up. The voice was so close this time, I could almost feel its breath against my ear. But no one was near me. No one was there. My heart was racing now. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to turn around and face whatever was there. But something urged me to. Slowly, my head turned. And there it was. A shape just a few feet away, emerging from the darkness, its outline barely visible against the black night. It was human in shape, but its features were obscured, like the figure was made of shadow itself. The outline wavered, shifting as if it were made of smoke. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place, as if my body knew I couldn't run. It took a step closer, the sound of its footfall impossibly loud in the silence of the street. And then it spoke again. Jason. The voice was low, raspy, distorted. It didn't sound like a person anymore. It sounded like something else, something unnatural. My name wasn't a word anymore. It was an echo, stretched thin and twisted. I should have screamed. I should have turned and run. But I didn't. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the figure that was slowly closing the distance between us. The thing moved forward another step, and I saw something that sent a surge of terror through my entire body. A hand stretched out towards me, its fingers long and thin, reaching, grasping. It wasn't just the figure that was moving now. The air around it seemed to warp, as if it were bending toward me, pulling the world itself into its grasp. I finally snapped out of it. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the pavement as I sprinted down the street, each step carrying me farther from the thing that had reached out for me. The shadows seemed to lengthen as I ran, the night stretching out unnaturally. I glanced back once, just once, to see the shape still following me, its movements smooth and fluid, like it was made of the night itself. It wasn't running, but it was there, a constant presence behind me, keeping pace with every step I took. I didn't stop to think about where I was running. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to feel safe, to feel like I was in control again. But the longer I ran, the more I realized something. I wasn't getting any farther away from it. The streets, the familiar landmarks, they didn't make sense anymore. Every corner I turned, every street I passed, looked exactly the same. It was as if I was running in circles, stuck in an endless loop. And the shape? It was always there, just behind me, never getting closer but never falling behind. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The fear settled in, cold and heavy. The city was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. I had to stop. I had to face whatever was chasing me. I couldn't keep running forever. I slowed to a stop, panting heavily, my heart in my throat. The street was completely empty now, eerily silent. No shadows moved. No figure loomed behind me. I was alone, but I could still feel it deep inside my chest, like a weight pressing down on my ribs. Something was wrong. Something was here. And then, just as the panic started to claw its way up my throat again, I heard the faintest sound. A whisper right behind me. Jason. I didn't turn around this time. I couldn't. Instead, I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, faster than I thought possible. And as I rounded the next corner, I felt the air around me shift. The weight lifted, just a little. The sensation of being followed faded, as though whatever it was had decided to leave me behind. For the first time that night, I slowed down. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept moving. I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within me. The streets around me had become unnervingly quiet. The weight of the presence I'd been running from had lifted, but only temporarily. It still lingered in the back of my mind like a dark cloud. I stumbled down an alleyway, looking for a place to breathe, to gather myself. I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. The unease clawed at my insides, and the shadows that stretched over the pavement seemed to grow darker, more oppressive with each passing second. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, desperate for something familiar, something to ground me. My hand trembled as I unlocked it. I opened the security camera app, mostly out of habit, but also because it felt like the only thing left in my control. The little camera icon blinked, and the screen flickered to life, showing a live feed of the corridor in the building I had just left. I frowned, unsure what to expect, but as I stared at the screen, my eyes went wide. The camera was still running. The view was familiar, an empty hallway. I was used to seeing it when I checked the feed during late nights working on my writing. The corridor always looked the same, dimly lit, deserted, still. But tonight, something was different. In the corner of the screen, I saw it. A shadow. A shape moving across the frame, just beyond the edge of the camera's view. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow didn't belong there. The hallway was empty. It should have been empty. The building was quiet, as it always was. But now, in the grainy footage, I saw a figure moving silently just beyond the reach of the camera's lens. I tapped the screen, zooming in, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure came into clearer view. It was tall, its features indistinct, but there was something about its movements, slow, deliberate, that set my nerves on edge. It moved like a human, but its silhouette didn't quite make sense. And then it happened. The shadow stopped. It stayed still for a moment, as if it were aware of the camera. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it, someone stepped into the shot. A person, right where the shadow had been. But it wasn't me. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The person in the hallway was wearing a dark hoodie, their face obscured by the shadows. They were looking straight at the camera. Their gaze pierced through the lens, like they were staring directly at me. I froze. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to press anything. I just stared. And then, as quickly as the figure appeared, they vanished. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The feed was static for a moment, but when it cleared, the hallway was empty again. Completely empty. The person was gone. The shadow had vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine, but before I could process what I was seeing, something else caught my attention. The camera's timestamp. The time on the screen read exactly the same as the moment I had just left the building. How could that be? I looked around. I was standing outside the building. I had been out of there for at least 15 minutes. But the camera feed was showing something I couldn't explain. I hurriedly closed the app, my pulse racing. I shoved my phone back into my pocket, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. I had to go back. I had to check the building, confront whatever it was that had been following me. But the closer I got to the entrance, the more the weight in my chest grew heavier, like an invisible force pushing me away. I stood there, in front of the building, staring at the locked door. My reflection in the glass felt foreign, as though I was looking at someone else. Someone who wasn't quite there. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I pushed the cold handle down. But before I could enter, something stopped me. A voice, soft and distant, whispering my name from somewhere inside the building. Jason. I turned around, my heart hammering. But I saw nothing. No one. Just the quiet street, the empty sidewalk. I looked back at the door, trying to muster the courage to walk inside. But as I stared at it, the voice came again, closer this time. Jason. It's already too late. My breath hitched. I didn't know if the voice was in my head or if it had come from inside the building. But in that moment, I knew something had changed. I didn't know who had spoken. But I was sure of one thing. Whatever had been lurking, whatever had been watching me, it had been here before. It had been waiting for me. And now, I couldn't escape it. I stood there, frozen, as the voice echoed in my head. It's already too late. I wanted to turn around, to run, to get away from whatever presence was out there, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, my breath shallow. The only thing I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Jason. It was coming from behind me again, but there was no one there. Not a soul in sight. The street was empty, the buildings around me silent. But the voice, distinct, clear, was real. It was inside me now, wrapped around my thoughts like a dark cloud. I tried to shake it off, but my feet refused to budge. My hand still hovered over the door handle, as if something was pulling me inside against my will. I heard footsteps. Soft, almost imperceptible, behind me. I spun around, my body trembling, but again, nothing. The street remained unchanged. Empty. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating. It was as if something was right there, so close I could almost feel it, yet invisible. Then, I noticed something that chilled me to the core. Across the street, just outside the shadows of a building, I saw it. A figure. Standing still, like a statue, watching me. It was tall and dressed in dark clothing, just like the shadow I'd seen earlier in the camera feed. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its gaze, heavy and suffocating. I knew without a doubt that it was waiting for me. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I didn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was as though something inside me was telling me that I needed to face it, confront whatever it was. I took a slow, hesitant step forward, and the figure didn't move. It didn't react. It just stood there, unmoving. Jason, the voice again, this time as a whisper, close to my ear. But when I looked, there was no one there. I gritted my teeth, finally summoning enough courage to walk towards the building to confront whatever this was. I was so close to the door now that I could see my reflection in the glass. My face looked pale, haunted. But there was something else in my reflection. Something different. Behind me, in the reflection, the figure was there. Standing just a few feet away, watching me. But when I turned around, it wasn't there. It couldn't be. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. How was this possible? Was I seeing things? Or had I become part of whatever dark reality was pulling me in? Jason, this time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was clear, sharp, unmistakable. I spun around. There, standing directly in front of me, was the figure. The same one from the camera footage, the same shadow, the same presence. Its face was still hidden, but now I could see its hands, long, thin, and pale. They reached out toward me. "No," I whispered, stepping back, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The figure's hand touched my shoulder, sending a shock of cold through my body. A rush of images flooded my mind. Moments from my life that I couldn't explain, fragments of memories that didn't make sense, my own writing, the story I'd been working on for so long, everything bleeding together. The figure's presence felt like the end of it all. Like this was a culmination of some kind of twisted fate, a story written long before I ever put pen to paper. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, it stopped. The figure was gone. The street was quiet again. The weight on my shoulders lifted. But I was no longer the same. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my body trembling. I looked around, expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. The world seemed to have returned to normal, if normal could ever be the same after this. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking uncontrollably as I opened the camera feed once more. I watched the screen as it showed the corridor in the building I had just left. Everything was as it should be. But then I saw it. The timestamp on the camera feed had changed. It no longer matched the time when I'd left the building. The feed was showing the exact moment when I had touched the door handle, when the figure had first appeared. It was like the camera had recorded something that hadn't happened yet. Something that was still to come. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't just a shadow following me. It was something much worse. Something that had been watching me, waiting for me to finally come to terms with it. And now, it was a part of me. I looked up from my phone, staring into the darkened street ahead. The world had shifted once again. I wasn't sure what had just happened. But I knew one thing. This wasn't over. Have you ever stumbled upon something that didn't belong? Something that should not exist? I was just trying to fix a broken pipe in the basement of my new house. The house, old and worn, was cheap, too cheap, but I thought I could make it work. I had lived in the city for years, moving around in cramped apartments, always searching for the next place to settle. When this house appeared on the market, I thought it was perfect. Quiet neighborhood, distant from the noise of the city. A chance to breathe, to reset. But the basement, I hadn't been down there much. The house had an unsettling feel to it, and every time I went downstairs, I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling. An odd sense that something wasn't quite right. That day, I needed to get the pipe fixed before the leak grew worse. I made my way down the creaky wooden steps into the cold, dimly lit basement. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The only light came from a single bulb hanging in the center of the room. I had to pull some old boxes out of the way before I could reach the pipes. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But as I moved the boxes aside, I saw it clearly. New stairs. They were hidden behind an old stack of crates I hadn't moved yet. The stairs weren't there when I first moved in, I was sure of it. The stairs looked old, like the rest of the house, but they were different. The wood was darker, more weathered, and they seemed to lead down into a part of the basement that I had never explored. My heart raced a little, but I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks. It was just another part of the house, right? Something I hadn't noticed before. But why would stairs appear like that? The thought lingered as I slowly approached the base of the steps. A chill ran down my spine as I placed my hand on the top step. It felt colder than the rest of the basement. Much colder. I could hear the faintest of sounds, whispers. Soft, almost imperceptible, like voices from far away. But there was no one else in the house. Just me. The air around the stairs seemed to thicken, and the whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the unease building. Something wasn't right about this. I should have turned back. But instead, I found myself stepping down. With each step I took, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. It was as if they were coming from the very walls. But there was no one there. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me, a force I couldn't see but could certainly feel. My hands trembled as I gripped the railing. The basement, which had always felt cold and empty, suddenly felt alive. The house seemed to be breathing. The walls closed in on me, and I wondered if I was imagining it, or if there was something deeper here, something that didn't want to be found. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The space was larger than I had expected, far larger than the basement had been above. But it was dark. I could barely make out the outline of the walls, and the whispers were now a low hum that vibrated in the air around me. I moved forward, my steps echoing in the empty space. As I passed one of the walls, my eyes caught something, a faint outline of a door hidden in the shadows. I hadn't seen it before. It seemed to be sealed shut, but there was something about it that pulled me closer. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to open it, to see what was beyond. Before I could reach it, I heard it again. A sound. A low scraping. It was coming from behind the door. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't my imagination this time. Something was in there. The whispers had turned to murmurs, and now they felt like voices, familiar voices. But I couldn't place them. I didn't want to stay any longer, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something in me urged me to stay, to understand. But what was it that I was meant to understand? I slowly reached for the doorknob, my hand cold as ice. The scraping sound continued, and I could feel the air growing heavier. I hesitated for a moment, then twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but pure darkness beyond. No light. No sound. Only the cold, suffocating blackness. And then, as I stepped forward, the whispers stopped. It was as though everything had gone silent, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But just as I was about to turn back, the door slammed shut behind me. The room felt smaller now. The whispers had returned, louder this time, more urgent. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was no longer in the basement. I didn't know where I was. And then I heard the footsteps. Have you ever found something that you're certain wasn't there before? Something small but unsettling enough to make you question everything around you? That's how it started for me. It was late at night when I found them. The stairs. I'd been living in the old house for months, and I knew every creak of its floors, every draft through the hallways. The basement, like the rest of the house, was forgotten and dark, filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. But that night, something was different. I was down there, cleaning up a few things I'd left behind, when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the shadows flickering in the dim light. But when I stepped closer, I knew there were new stairs leading further down into the darkness. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The stairs were old, worn, like the rest of the house, but their appearance was jarring. They led deeper into the basement, into a part of the house I had never seen, a part that should not exist. I tried to ignore them, turning away to focus on the boxes I'd been moving, but curiosity gnawed at me. Why hadn't I noticed them before? I could hear my breath in the still air, the sound of my own heartbeat against the quiet. The basement was eerily still, except for a soft sound that started low, barely audible. A whisper. I froze. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the house settling. But no, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I stared at the stairs, my mind racing. What was that? Was it coming from the stairs? It was as though the darkness itself was calling to me, a distant, murmuring voice drawing me closer. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet heavy on the cold concrete floor. The air around the stairs felt different, colder, thicker, like it was pressing against me. The whisper grew louder. It was coming from the darkness below, and the sound, it wasn't just one voice. There were multiple, layered over each other, all speaking in hushed tones. The more I focused, the more it seemed to grow. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a decision. I couldn't resist any longer. The pull of the unknown was too strong. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the railing, old wood slick with age. I had to know what lay beyond. Slowly, I descended. Each step creaked beneath my weight, but the noise seemed insignificant compared to the quiet that surrounded me. The basement above was bathed in light from the single bulb overhead, but as I stepped lower, the darkness grew thicker. The further I went, the less I could see. The whispering voices were now louder, more distinct. I could almost make out words, but they seemed to slip away as soon as I tried to focus on them. They felt so close. And yet, when I looked around, I couldn't see anyone. There was only the staircase stretching further into the blackness below. I was halfway down when the temperature dropped sharply, a gust of cold air hitting me like a wall. My breath came out in visible puffs as I reached for the next step. And then I heard it. A soft shuffle, like footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The air around me seemed to shimmer, as though something was there, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the next step, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My hands were slick with sweat now, despite the cold. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Come closer, they seemed to say. You know you want to. I shook my head, trying to block out the voices. I needed to turn back. This was madness. But my body wouldn't listen. I was drawn to the bottom of the stairs, to the unknown that lay in the dark. I had to see it. The whispering reached a crescendo, almost deafening, just as I set foot on the bottom step. And then, as I looked into the dark expanse of the basement below, something moved. Something huge. Something I couldn't see, but I felt it. It shifted in the darkness, its presence suffocating, filling the space around me. I took a step back, my heart pounding. I had never felt this kind of fear before, this instinctual, primal terror. But I couldn't look away. The darkness wasn't empty. It wasn't quiet. And whatever was in it was waiting for me. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, unwilling to obey my mind. The whispering grew louder, now almost screaming in my ears. My head throbbed with the pressure, my body trembling with the weight of it all. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the darkness shifted again. Something stepped out of it. I couldn't see what it was. It was too dark. But I felt it. It was close. Too close. I tried to turn, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, standing there in the bottom of the basement, with something in the darkness just behind me. The voices stopped. Everything stopped. And then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. The breath on my neck was freezing, sharp, like an icy blade against my skin. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I thought it would burst through my ribcage. The air was thick, too heavy to breathe, and yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the void before me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I don't know how long I stood there, my legs locked in place, every muscle trembling, but the presence behind me. I could feel it. It wasn't human, not anything I could comprehend. It was something old, something that had always been there, hiding in the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone like me to wander too close. The whispering had stopped. I didn't dare breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to move. The air felt so thick now, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I was suffocating. My hands were clammy, the sweat cold against my skin. But there was still something in the darkness. I could feel it, just out of my sight. It was like the shadows themselves had formed into something tangible, something watching, waiting. The weight of it pressed in on me, making it harder to breathe, to think. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle. It was behind me, like a footstep in the dust, but it didn't stop. It continued, slow and deliberate, just a few inches behind me. The sound of someone moving closer. I could feel my breath catch on my throat. I wanted to turn, to look, but every instinct screamed at me not to. Whatever it was right there. Right behind me. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer. My legs finally moved. I took a step back, my foot catching on the edge of the last step. I stumbled, my heart leaping into my throat. My hands flailed, trying to catch myself, but my mind was focused on only one thing. The darkness. The thing that was in it. The whispering returned, louder this time, but it was different. It wasn't one voice, not anymore. There were many voices, layered over each other, murmuring, chanting, words I couldn't understand, but I could feel them. I could feel the weight of them on my mind, pressing in from all sides. I finally turned. What I saw, or rather, what I didn't see, was worse than anything I could have imagined. The darkness, the thing behind me, it wasn't clear. It didn't have a shape, a form I could recognize. It was like the air itself had become solid, like the very shadows had taken shape and were moving around me. But the thing, the presence, was there. I could feel it. My breath quickened, shallow and frantic. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing or not seeing. The whispering grew louder, faster. It wasn't just in my ears anymore. It was inside my mind, pressing in like fingers curling around my thoughts. The voices were no longer indistinct. I could make out a few words now, though they didn't make sense. Come closer. Join us. We've been waiting. The voices wrapped around me, curling through the thick, suffocating air. They were so close. So close I could almost touch them. But I couldn't see the thing that was making them. I couldn't see what was in the darkness. And that was worse. I took another step back, my feet scrambling, desperate to find solid ground. My heart was a drumbeat in my chest, too loud, too fast. Every fiber of my being screamed to me to leave, to get away. But the stairs behind me, those damn stairs, I couldn't climb them fast enough. The air was growing thicker, heavier, pressing against me with every step I took backward. And then, in that fleeting moment of panic, I felt it again. A cold touch. On my arm. I froze. It wasn't just a sensation. It was real, solid. Like fingers brushing against my skin, cold as ice. I whipped around, my eyes searching the darkness, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible. My heart raced, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I backed up until I was at the base of the stairs again, my hand fumbling for the railing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. The presence, the thing, was right there, so close that I could almost hear its breath, its heartbeat, if it even had one. But I had to leave. I had to get out of that basement, out of that house. I turned and ran. I sprinted up the stairs, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the fear clawing at me from behind. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the door at the top of the stairs, yanking it open. Light spilled into the darkness, but the whispering didn't stop. It followed me, swirling in my mind, in my ears, louder now, insistent. The thing behind me hadn't followed me up the stairs. But it didn't have to. I could still feel it, close, waiting for me. I slammed the door shut, my hand shaking violently as I locked it. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. The basement door was just a door. The stairs were gone. There was no sign of anything strange. Except for one thing. The whispering. It didn't stop. I could still hear it, echoing in my head. Come back, come closer. The voices, the words, they circled around me like a cloud of insects, buzzing, relentless. And then, in the silence that followed, I realized the truth. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left. It wasn't just in the basement. It was with me. It had followed me. It had always been with me. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, made me jump. The house was too quiet, but it was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, heavy and suffocating. Every corner of my room felt alive, every shadow stretching toward me, every movement feeling just a little too deliberate. I kept hearing the whispering in my ears, even though there was no one around. The next morning, the daylight didn't make me feel any better. It couldn't chase away the cold that had settled in my chest, the lingering sense that something was wrong. Something was following me, watching me. But there was no clear threat. No shape, no figure, no clear danger, just the feeling that it was always there, just out of sight. I tried to ignore it. I forced myself to go about my day as usual. The house was old, full of creaks and groans. I'd been in it for months, and I knew every crevice, every corner. But I hadn't noticed that basement stairway before. I'd been in that basement 100 times, looking for supplies, checking the fuse box, storing things. Never before had I seen those stairs. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But that didn't explain the touch, the cold fingers brushing against my arm. It didn't explain the whispering that seemed to press into my skull. By the time evening came, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was waiting. The walls felt thicker, the air more oppressive. I found myself staring at the basement door again, watching it as if I could somehow sense what lay beyond it. The thought of going back down there made my stomach churn. But it was the only way to understand what was happening. To confront it. To face whatever was lurking down there. I knew I had to go back. The shadows seemed to stretch further than they should have as I descended into the basement, every step echoing through the silence. The old stairs creaked underfoot, as if they too were aware of what awaited me. I reached the bottom, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring into the dark. The air felt different this time, heavier, colder. The shadows around me were deeper, like they were closing in. But the stairs, those stairs, were still there. They were still there, and they seemed different. Not just because I hadn't seen them before, but because now they looked as if they belonged. The wood, the edges, the way they seemed to sink into the darkness. As if they had always been here, like they had always been waiting for someone to find them. The whispers began again. Low, almost imperceptible at first. Like a breeze rustling through leaves, but these weren't leaves. These were words. Words that made my blood run cold. Come closer. Join us. The voices were soft at first, like a distant hum, but they grew louder, clearer with each passing moment. My body was trembling, but I couldn't stop myself from walking forward. I needed to understand what this was, what had happened in this house, what had come into my life without warning. The steps felt wrong beneath my feet, unnatural. But I couldn't stop. The whispers were now almost urgent, begging me to take that next step, to descend deeper into the abyss. My feet moved of their own accord, each step carrying me further into the darkness, further into whatever was waiting down there. The temperature dropped with every step I took. The air was thick now, suffocating, like breathing in water. My head began to spin, my vision narrowing. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, as the darkness pressed in from all sides. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped. All at once, there was silence. The kind of silence that fills the spaces between thoughts, where even your heartbeat seems too loud. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between the suffocating darkness and the crushing silence. But then, a new sound broke through the quiet. A footstep. A single, deliberate step, coming from the darkness ahead of me. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it. The echo of a foot hitting the ground, followed by another, then another. The sound was slow, methodical, as if something was pacing in the shadows, waiting for me to react. I turned, and in that moment, I felt it again, the touch. Cold fingers on my neck, like they were reaching from the shadows. I spun around, but nothing was there. Nothing visible, nothing tangible. Yet I felt it. I felt the weight of it, the presence that had been stalking me from the very first moment I stepped into this house. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, more insistent. Turn around. Look at us. Come deeper. The words were so clear now, so undeniable. It was a command. They wanted me to look. They wanted me to see what lay hidden in the dark. But I knew, deep down, that I didn't want to see. Whatever was down there, it wasn't something I could understand. It wasn't something that belonged to this world. I took a step back, then another. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, desperate to get away from the presence, from the voices, from the darkness that was closing in on me. I turned and ran, the air pressing against me as if trying to hold me in place. The footsteps were behind me now, moving faster, gaining on me. They were all around me, echoing in the basement, bouncing off the walls, mocking my attempts to escape. I reached the stairs. I grabbed the railing, almost ripping it from the wall as I pulled myself up, my feet stumbling over each step, the darkness reaching for me with every second. I made it to the top. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my hands trembling so badly that I could barely lock it. The whispering didn't stop. It was in my head now, louder than ever. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did no good. The words were inside me, inside my mind, twisting and turning, pulling at my thoughts. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from the weight of it all, I heard a voice. A different voice. Not the whispers, but the voice. It was clear, cold, and without hesitation. You can't leave. The voice echoed in my head, a command, not a question. You can't leave. I froze. My body, my heart, every muscle locked in place as if my body understood something my mind hadn't yet caught up with. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It wasn't distant or soft. It was loud, commanding, and familiar. I knew it, but I couldn't place it. It was as if it had always been there, lingering in the back of my mind, waiting for this moment to break through. The whispering faded into silence again, leaving only the chilling phrase hanging in the air. I turned around slowly, my body still trembling from the fear, and stared at the basement door. The darkness below me felt like it was staring back, breathing with me, watching me. I didn't know how long I stood there, trapped in the space between the door and whatever lay beyond. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. I was acutely aware of every inch of the house, the creaks of the floorboards under my feet, the way the air seemed to hum, the way the walls felt like they were closing in on me. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed answers. I couldn't go on like this, trapped in fear, not knowing what was happening. I had to go back down there, back into the dark, into the unknown. The next few moments felt like a blur, but somehow I was standing in front of the basement door again. I reached out, hesitating, my hand inches from the cold, rusted knob. The fear was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere. But now, something else had joined it. A kind of desperation. A need to understand. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The basement was just as dark as before, just as cold. But now, the silence was thick, almost suffocating. I stepped down onto the first step, feeling a creak beneath my weight. The temperature dropped again, colder than before, and I felt a shiver run through me as I descended. But there was something else now. A figure. A shadow. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it. It was standing at the bottom of the stairs, just out of reach of the dim light at the top. And yet, I could feel its eyes on me, watching me. It felt like a presence more than a form, something that couldn't be understood with just sight. The whispers started again. They were soft at first, but they were growing, getting louder. I could hear words now. Clearer. Urgent. Come closer. Join us. The voice. That voice again. It wasn't just in my head. It was coming from the shadows. I took a step down. Another. And then, just as I reached the bottom, I saw it. Not with my eyes, but with my senses. It was there. The figure. The shape. It was standing in the center of the room, just beyond the edge of the light. I should have run. I should have turned around, slammed the door, and never looked back. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot. The figure was moving now, but slowly, almost like it was gliding toward me. No footsteps, no sound. Just movement in the dark, like something that wasn't quite real. I could feel its presence, like it was pushing against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was like I had lost the ability to speak. The silence in the basement was so thick, it swallowed everything. The figure stopped just a few feet in front of me. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. It was a shape, a shadow that twisted and stretched, like smoke caught in the wind. It didn't have a face, just a dark, swirling mass where its features should have been. And then, in that moment of absolute terror, I realized something. It wasn't alone. There were more shadows in the dark, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I took a step back, my mind screaming to escape. But before I could move, the whispers grew louder, all of them speaking at once, surrounding me, pulling at my mind. Stay. Look at us. Don't leave. The figure reached out, its tendrils of darkness stretching toward me, wrapping around my body, pulling me closer. I tried to break free, but it was too strong. My body felt like it was being dragged, inch by inch, toward the center of the basement, where the shadows were thickest. The darkness seemed to consume everything around me, eating up the light until there was nothing left but the oppressive blackness. And then, suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. The basement was completely silent again. But I wasn't alone anymore. The whispers, now frantic, were all around me. In my head. In my ears. The shadows, they weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures. People, if you could call them that. They were moving, slowly, in my direction. Their faces, if they even had them, were featureless. Their bodies, twisted, deformed. But they were real. They were here. They were close. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped. The room fell silent. I was still trapped in the basement, but it felt different now. The air was thick, suffocating. The shadows had retreated, but I could still feel them, lingering in the corners, watching me. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know who they were or why they were here. But one thing was certain now. I was no longer alone in this house. The shadows were with me. They were waiting. And I couldn't escape. The silence in the basement was maddening. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet, the absence of sound that made you feel at peace or isolated. No. This was a silence that pressed against my ears, thick and heavy, like it was wrapping itself around my skull, suffocating me from the inside out. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and panicked, echoing in the stillness, but nothing else. Not a creak of the floorboards, not the sound of the air conditioning. Just the heavy silence that seemed to pulse with something, waiting. I knew they were still there. The shadows. I could feel them in the corners of my eyes, moving, shifting, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. For a long time, I just stood there. Frozen. The basement felt colder now, colder than before, the air thick with something I couldn't name. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and the whispering began again, soft at first, like the faintest breeze brushing my ear. But as I listened, it grew louder, clearer. Words. You shouldn't have come. Now you're part of us. The voice wasn't one, but many, dozens of them, all speaking at once, their words layered over one another, blending together until it was impossible to tell where one voice ended and the next began. The sound of their collective murmurs churned in my chest, vibrating deep inside me, like the hum of an old machine. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone, the feeling of it, was unmistakable. It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. I took a shaky step back, my hands slick with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to run, to get out, to escape from whatever this was, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt like I was trapped in place, caught in the grip of something I couldn't understand. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I turned, almost instinctively, to face it. The shadows at the edge of the basement were shifting again, curling and twisting like smoke, drawing closer. I could almost make out shapes now, shapes that resembled human figures, though they were distorted and unnatural. Their edges were blurred, their forms ever-changing, flickering like a broken film reel. The room seemed to pulse with their presence. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. It felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with their voices, the very air charged with energy. A chill ran through me, settling deep in my bones, as if I were standing in the presence of something ancient and terrible. The figures, no longer mere shadows, seemed to move closer, their forms becoming more defined with every passing second. I reached for the stairs, my fingers trembling as I touched the railing, but as soon as I made contact, the shadows lunged. The sound was like 1,000 feet running on gravel, a rush of air, a weight pushing against me from all sides. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked in my throat, strangled by the pressure that built around me. It was too much. I ran. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my feet pounding against the cold stone steps, my body desperate to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to pull at me from behind. But the moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, something stopped me. It wasn't a force I could see. It wasn't like being held back by hands or chains. It was the air itself, thick and dense, refusing to let me go. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. I turned back to face the shadows, now no longer distant but right in front of me. They were all around, circling, reaching for me. I could see their faces now, if you could call them faces. Blank, featureless masks, with only hollow, empty spaces where their eyes should have been. Their mouths, if they had them, were drawn into jagged lines, stretching into unnatural, toothless grins. One of them reached out. The cold, inhuman touch brushed against my skin, sending a wave of icy terror through me. You belong to us now, a voice hissed from the darkness, a voice that wasn't quite human. You've been chosen. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were closing in, their hands, or what might have been hands, stretching toward me, their whispers a constant, suffocating noise in my ears. You'll never leave, they said. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the basement. I was still in the house, but everything had changed. The walls were different. The floor under my feet was unfamiliar. The house had transformed into something twisted, something wrong. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the doors now leading to rooms that I had never seen before. There was a strange, pulsing light coming from the end of the hall, an eerie glow that I couldn't place. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, unsteady, as if I had just woken from a nightmare. I reached for the walls to steady myself, and as my hand brushed against the cold surface, I felt the familiar pressure of the shadows again. They were here. They were still watching. But they weren't silent anymore. Now, they were speaking to me. You can't escape. Not now. Not ever. I closed my eyes, but their voices didn't stop. They were inside my head, inside my skin. They were with me, always. I wasn't sure if I was still in the house or if the house had become part of me. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. There was no way out. And there never had been. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.